As mountain bikers, we should all have some kind of basic mechanical skill under our belt in order to look after our bikes. Now, this doesn't mean the necessity of being able to strip down a suspension fork or anything advanced like that, but it does mean you should know the more basic skills so when you can't get to a bike shop, you can look after your bike yourself. Now, this video has all of those major essential skills in there, and of course there's going to be a few other tips in there along the way. Okay, so first up is how to use an Allen key properly. Also known as a hex wrench. You might be wondering why I say using one properly, because there's only one way to use them, but it's very easy to select the wrong one, it's very easy to slip, and it's very easy to use one that's damaged without knowing. So there's a few little things you need to know here. So first up, make sure you've got a decent selection of Allen keys. Now, this doesn't mean having to spend a fortune. You could have a multi-tool like this one from Park. Very useful, it does most of the bolts on all around a bike, and also means you can take it with you if you want to. The other option, of course, is to get some kind of free setup. Now, these tend to come with bikes and components you buy. Great, because they're free and they're going to be able to serve you for many years if you look after them. However, they do start to wear, especially the cheaper ones, and as they wear, they can damage the heads of the Allen key bolts all around your bike, so you don't want to be doing that. So great to use, but just take care that they're in good condition and replace them as you need to. Next up would be a full set of workshop spec Allen keys. Now, these are very expensive for good reason. They're made of extremely hard steel, like S-grade steel, which is for pro mechanics out there. They have some hidden features. You've got these little spinners so you can send longer bolts home, and they've even got rifled sections on them so you can remove those rounded out bolts when you do encounter them. However, pro quality comes with a pro price tag, so it might not suit you. The last option would be a trail multi-tool. Now, this has just about everything under the sun on it. In fact, Henry used one of these, if not this actual one, to completely take his bike apart recently for a video. That's going to be in a link underneath here, just to show you what these are capable of. They're amazing. However, they're not necessarily the best thing to use on a day-to-day basis because of the fact that some of the tools on them are quite small, which means you've got more chance of slipping. Great when you're out on a trail to rescue a situation, perhaps not quite as good on a daily basis, although if you need to start somewhere, there's a good place to go. Now, the last thing to take into account is the torque settings of bolts. Now, if you're not doing too much on a bike, it's nothing to worry about, but it's very easy to snap a bolt or damage a lightweight component if you over tighten it. And worse, if you under tighten something and at least something coming loose, it could fail on you or it could be dangerous out on the trail. So if that sounds like a concern, invest in some kind of torque wrench. Now, it could just be bits for an existing ratchet spanner you have, or it could be a dedicated bike one. This one from Park's very simple. It's got adjustable torque setting. It comes with bits in the handle and it does the job great. Although perhaps you want to save a bit more money and consider something like this one. This is a Topic one. It's a ratchet tool. It has all the stuff that you'd use out on the trail, and it has different settings, different torque bits here that you can use it in conjunction with them. A really good value piece of kit. You can take it with you and you can use it at home every day as well. So just consider that if that's something that bothers you, or perhaps if you've got an expensive bike and you want to take care of those lightweight carbon parts. Now, there's two last things you need to take into account. One, always take your time and make sure the Allen key is properly inserted into the head. If it's not in properly, it can slip. And the last one, and the most important one, is make sure you use the correct size. Sometimes, especially with the smaller ones, a 2 or a 2.5, quite often you can confuse them. And if you use the smaller one in a 2.5, you're going to end up rounding out the head. The same can also happen if you have a huge selection of loose Allen keys like this. If you had, say, some Imperial ones in there, like a 3/16, you might reach for that by accident, thinking it was a 5mm, and go to adjust a 5mm bolt, and you could end up rounding out the head. So if you do have any random Imperial ones in amongst your collection, try and keep them to one side, because mountain bikes are all about the metric. Next up is changing a tyre. Mountain bikes all have tyres on them, and at some point you're going to get a puncture. Whether you're set up tubeless or you have a good old-fashioned inner tube in there, you're going to need to know how to take this off, because we still get punctures. Basically, it's going to happen. So you will need some kind of tyre levers. Don't use metal ones. Metal ones can damage the tyre, they can damage the inner tube, and more importantly, they can damage the rim on your bike. Make sure you use nylon or plastic ones. They often clip together like these so you don't lose them. The best advice is to get 3. Chances are you'll only ever need 1. Sometimes you need a backup one, and you're probably going to lose one, so get a 3rd one for good measure. Of course, you're going to need some sort of pump. A floor standing pump is going to make things a lot easier for you in the long term. However, a hand pump is probably more useful because of the fact you can use it at home and out on the trail. So just take care of what you pick. Make sure you pick the right things. Now, along with learning how to take a tyre off and repairing a tyre and all that sort of stuff, you want to go the old-fashioned route and learn how to repair an inner tube as well. If you're not using tubeless, you will have an inner tube on the inside. Now, whilst you could just buy a new one, make sure you've got no thorns on the inside of that tyre casing and replace it. It's not very good for the environment, so you want to make sure you get the most use out of it as possible. Get yourself an old-fashioned feather edge patch kit and learn how to use them. It's actually quite therapeutic. Next up is get to know your cockpit setup. Now, you might just buy your bike from the bike shop, they set it up for you, and you get many years of great use out of it, but you won't be getting the most out of it unless you experiment with your setup. We're talking about the thickness of your grips, the way you roll them backwards and forwards, the same with your bars. Are you comfortable? Do you think it's too low? Is it too high? Is it too far? Is it too near? There's so many different variants with your cockpit, and I do encourage everyone to experiment with things a little bit. Brake lever position. The general rule of thumb is when you're seated, you run the brake levers in line with your arms, but that's not right for everyone. I like my brake levers nearly horizontal at times. Other people like theirs nearly vertically down. There's no right and there's no wrong, but by experimenting with things, not only will you find things more comfortable when your riding will develop, but you'll also start to learn about your cockpit. You'll start to learn how your bars are mounted onto the bike. You'll start to learn about how the headset bearings are compressed, and before you know it, you'll have learned how to take apart the front of your bike completely. It's all quite simple, it's just a series of Allen keys, which is why it's so important to make sure you know how to use those things right. Setting up the sag on your suspension. Now, this is absolutely crucial and everyone can do this at home. Now, many of us will have a mountain bike with some sort of suspension on it. Usually we'll at least have front suspension, so you'll have some sort of suspension fork. If the fork was on your bike when you got it and it's an air fork, it will come with an air pump specially for it. If you bought the fork aftermarket, it will also come with a pump. So either way, you should have one. If you don't, get one. They're essential, and setting up your sag is very easy. All you got to do is set it up to your rider weight when you're on the bike. Now, the guidelines are between 20 and 30% depending on the model of fork and depending on your preferences. Some like it softer, some like it harder. Now, getting your sag set up correctly, can't emphasize this enough. It will go the difference from your bike being quite good off-road to really inspiring your confidence and giving you the grip and support and comfort that you want from your suspension fork. It makes a massive difference riding a fork that's set up correctly. And honestly, playing with them as well, it's actually quite good fun. So don't be put off with letting the air pressure out, putting it back in again, trying it harder, trying it softer. It's all experimentation. And with these little portable pumps, you can do this out on the trail as well. So don't feel that you need to just set it up once and forget about it. You might find by experimenting a bit more, you find a setup that works better for you. Like I said earlier in the video, no one setup is right for everyone. You've got to find what works for you. There will be a guideline to start with and then experiment and find what is the best one. Next up is adjusting your gears. Now, many people think there's a bit of a black art to this, but I'll let you in on a secret. It's actually dead easy. All you need to do is have the correct tools, good Allen keys or a screwdriver. You need a bit of patience and you need to just understand what all of the things do. All derailleurs, whether they're SRAM or Shimano, fundamentally work on the exact same principles. Now, there's going to be a video on mastering setting up your derailleur in the description underneath this one, so click through on that and it'll tell you everything you need to do to service and set up your rear derailleur. Now, I encourage everyone to learn how your derailleur works, because of the fact once you learn how it works, you won't run into problems down the line. And by doing this, you'll understand what the limit screws do, you'll understand how the tension in the cage works and how that affects other things on the bike. Now also, you'll understand when things go wrong, what they can possibly be. Being cable actuated, if you ride in wet or muddy conditions, quite often you'll find just a change of cable or a bit of lubricant inside the outer cable can remedy everything. Now, setting up your derailleur is immensely satisfying and there's nothing better than clean shifting. Okay, next up is learning how to set your bike up tubeless. Now, this might not be first on your agenda. It's definitely a skill to aspire to get to. There are serious performance enhancements to be had from running a bike with a tubeless setup. The first one, of course, is you're losing weight off the bit you're rotating. If you can lower the rotating weight on the bike, your bike is going to feel faster, it's going to feel more agile, it's going to be nicer to ride. They are all performance enhancements. The addition as well is you're removing those inner tubes that are already on your bike, so you can keep them as spares. You don't need to have spare inner tubes or spend more money on those. 2 of those will probably do you quite a long time. I honestly can't remember the last time I had a puncture with a tubeless setup. The other advantage, of course, is if you do get small punctures, often thorns and things like that, The tubeless sealant that you have will seal those small holes as you ride. Wave goodbye to the puncture. Setting up your tyres tubeless is a bit of a skill, and it does require a bit of a method to follow, and accordingly, because you can make mistakes, it's something that people stay away from. But honestly, I made a video, it's going to be in the description underneath this. It's dead simple, and I do it live on the video. It really is that simple. So check it out and put that on your list of things to do. It's a great upgrade and it's a great skill to learn as well. Okay, next up is installing a dropper post on your mountain bike. Now, many new bikes do come with them now, so if you've already got one on your bike, at some point you're going to need to take it out in order to maintain it or perhaps change the cable on it. So you're still going to need to know how to do this. And if you haven't got one yet, I'm sure it might be on your list of things that you want to aspire to buy further down the line, because they are one of the biggest performance enhancements you can put on any mountain bike. Now, they all fit slightly differently, so it really is a skill to learn. Now, the cable operated ones are a bit different to the hydraulic ones, but the thing you will need to learn is mastering your cable routing, which on many bikes tends to be internal. And that in itself comes with its own set of challenges. But by doing that, you're going to learn a lot about your bike. Now, take your time when you install a dropper post. Follow the manufacturer's instructions, because they all slightly are different. Some have the nipple at the lever end, some have them at the seat post end, some are hydraulic. They will all accordingly be slightly different, although the principles fundamentally are the same. Now, learning how to maintain the dropper post as well, that is also something that goes with the turf. And if you've got a suspension fork, it's quite likely that you'll have looked at the similar sort of maintenance things. We're talking about removing the seals, putting some oil behind them. Again, actually quite simple, but definitely something you should aspire to be able to do. There's going to be a link to how to install one of those in the description underneath. Good luck with that. The next up is learning how to bleed your brakes. Now, you might want to rely on your bike shop for this, sure. But sod's law, the time that you're going to need to bleed your brakes, that one time will be 5 minutes before you go riding. You discover that your levers are pulling to the bars. That's no good if it's a Sunday and you can't get to a bike shop. So learning to do it yourself really is an essential skill. And it isn't one that you should be afraid of, because actually it's quite simple. It just requires patience and a lot of it. So get yourself some kind of bleed kit that's going to be compatible for your bike. This one is for mineral oil, i.e. a Shimano system or a Magura system. But you can get different ones with different fittings to suit DOT systems, like the Avid or the SRAM systems on the market. And accordingly, you're going to need the correct oil. They're not interchangeable. You can't use mineral oil in a DOT system and vice versa. That is a DOT fluid. I cannot use that in a set of Shimano brakes. I need to use Shimano mineral fluid. The DOT fluid, you can use that in SRAM brakes, for example, or in Hope brakes. Make sure you get this right, and actually it's really satisfying. Also, bleeding your brakes, I do think, is something you should do at least annually, just to make sure there's clean fluid in there, make sure there's no air in there that you didn't realise, and to make sure that everything is working as well as it possibly should be. Also, in doing that, you're going to get much better at it, much faster at it, and you're going to find little cool shortcuts. One great shortcut is, if you've got air bubbles in there and you're struggling to get them to the actual levers, a good way to do it is to store your bike up on its back wheel overnight. And you can even do this with the levers sent so they're actually horizontally, so that would be vertically if your bike is upright, and with the top cylinders open, so actually the air bubbles can rise out by themselves. So there's loads of cool tips you can pick up just by experimenting. Think of it as bleeding a radiator at home. It is that simple. You just have to know how to do it. Now, there's going to be links to a Shimano video and a SRAM video in the description underneath there. Follow those and you should be able to do that yourself. Again, don't be afraid of it, but make sure that you do invest in the correct bleed kit and the correct fluid to suit your brakes. Now, finally, I would say is building a custom bike or building a frame up from components. Now, there honestly is nothing more satisfying in the world of mountain biking or even road biking as building your own project bike. It's even better than having a complete bike turning up. You have all of the parts there and you slowly and methodically put it all together using all of those skills that you've developed over your years of riding. It really is something great to aspire to do. And a good way to do that is to start upgrading your bike bit by bit. Over time, maybe you damage your rear derailleur in a crash and you'll need to replace it. Now, you'll learn in replacing a derailleur, you'll need to index your gears. You'll also need to change the cable on the derailleur and you'll need to split a chain. So straight away, there's 3 major jobs done that go along to building a bike up. Now, just think, every time you replace a part on your bike, you're learning a new skill if you choose to do it yourself. And before long, you'll be able to build a bike like this from the ground up. Honestly, it's so much fun to do and I can't encourage you all to do it. enough. It really is one of the coolest things you can do with your home bike skills. And actually, because mountain bikes are largely put together with Allen keys, you can do most of it yourself. Again, I'm going to put that video that Henry made using just a trail multi-tool in the description underneath this. It'll show you how much you can do with that. So if you think with a multi-tool and a few other tools, you can pretty much build your own bike from scratch.
Hello and welcome to GMBN Tech. Today I'm going to show you how to do a lower leg service or refresh the oil in your forks. Now this should be a 5-minute job for a confident or an experienced mechanic, but if this is your first time, then check out the link in our description where Doddy does a far more detailed video. However, if you want a quick run through or a refresher, stick with me. So you should absolutely be working with a clean set of forks so that no dirt falls in there and there's no damage to your forks. It's also a lot quicker and easier to work with them off the bike. Now you want to take that cap off over the rebound dial if you have one, and you'll have a 2mm bolt holding on your rebound dial. So just go easy with that, be gentle with it. It shouldn't be done up too tight, and it will be a little bit spring loaded sometimes. So careful it doesn't fire across the workshop. You'll have a little one, a spring, and then the bigger one. Set that aside. So you'll have 2 foot nuts on the bottom holding the lowers on. Mine is a 15mm for the bigger one over here. And you'll just want to set that to lefty-loosey or anti-clockwise. And just undo it a little bit, just so it's loose. And then my other one is a 10mm. And then all you want to do is loosen them about halfway along the threads. And then we're going to use our bolts and a hammer, a gentle plastic end, to tap them and shock them free. So we can undo those screws now and give your crush washers a check over. They should have nice square edges, otherwise you're going to need to replace them. And the little one should have a little crush washer. Sometimes they're stuck up here. If for any reason your lowers aren't coming off with a little tap, chances are crush washers got a little bit jammed in your lowers. I think that one needs replacing. Mine are a little bit chewed up, so I'm going to use some new ones. At this point, I like to put some gloves on. I've got some nitrile gloves here just to protect my hands and also keep them clean. And then get it over your tray or a bucket or an old bag or something to collect the oil. Make sure your O-rings at the top and just give them a good pull. And there, it should all drain out. And then it's cleanup time. Now, as this is a refresher and I keep on top of maintenance, I just like to wipe things down and then refresh the oil. If your oil is really black or dirty or you've somehow got grit in there, then you might want to clean these properly with some soapy water. I also have an old outer cable, which I like to wrap with some blue roll. You can use a tool or an old cloth or a towel or a t-shirt or something to basically clean out the lowers, basically trying to be as gentle as possible, not to scratch the lowers with anything. So a soft cable is my preference, and you can also push the blue roll back out if it gets stuck down. So that's one side. And do give them a quick inspection into the light. Make sure there's nothing in there dirt-wise, no scratches or anything like that. At this point, it's up to you if you want to use a pick to pull the foam rings out from underneath the seals here, and you can re-lube them up, clean them, re-lube them. Mine are looking in really good nick, so I'm just gonna add some oil to my lowers. They should be good to go. So in order to do that, we're going to put the lowers back really carefully. Make sure you've got it the right way around. Just poke the stanchions through the seals gently, line them up a little bit. It should go on with a gentle nudge, no force here. And then make sure your threads come out the bottom. everything lines up fine. And then in my stand, I tend to drop these down and hold them upside down and just pop those threads back in a little bit so that we can put the oil in there and it won't spill anywhere. So for my Fox 38s, I need 20 weight in the air side bath. So the air side bath is basically your lower on the air side, which is where you put the air in. So for me, 20 weight. So for these Fox 38s, it's 20 cc's of 20 weight. So that is 20 mil. And then because I've got a Grip 2 damper, I need some 5 weight in the damper side. So the damper side is the non-air side, or the bit where you put your rebound. If you have a Fit 4 like me, then it'll be 40 cc's of 5 weight. If you have a Grip 2, it's actually different. I believe it's 15 cc's of 20 weight. If you have any other forks, like RockShox, DBO, Marzocchi, whatever, then look for your service manual and it will tell you what oil you need, of what quantity. They'll all be different. You don't want to overload it or use oil that's not correct for your forks because it can hamper the performance. So you've refreshed everything and now it's just a case of putting it all back together in reverse order. So you'll get your bolts with your new crush washer if you needed it. So the little one on the little thread, big one on the big thread with your new big crush washer if you needed it. And then check your manufacturer's spec or your service manual to see what torque setting these are. For my Fox 38, it's 5 Newton meters. And use my torque wrench, already set to 5 Newton meters. So my big one, 15 mil. Now these don't need a lot of torque. 5 Newton meters might seem gentle, but the crush washer's there to seal them in. So it's perfectly adequate. And then it's the rebound dial. So you want your big bit on first. Make sure it's the right way round, and it should slot onto the bigger bit. Then you've got your spring and your lower dial. Sometimes these can move in, just make sure it's out enough. Get it onto there, and then it's back up to the 2 mil Allen key. And bear in mind that this is a tiny bolt with no more than 2 Newton meters. It is just nipping it up.
In today's video, we're going to show you how to install and set up a disc brake on your mountain bike. That includes trimming the hose down, fitting the olive and the barb, and if needed, doing a bit of a bleed on there as well. This is how you do it. In today's video, I'm going to install a 4-piston Shimano SLX brake to the front of this bike. Now the process really is the same no matter what the brand and whether it's a front or rear brake. The only real difference is the cable routing, etc. on the bike. Now there's 2 major types of cable routing on any mountain bike. There's external and internal. External kind of speaks for itself. You'll have dedicated clips or cable guides, maybe using zip ties, something like that, to hold the cables in place. Well, there's internal routing. Now with internal, there falls 2 major styles. Newer styles tend to have channels on the inside of the frame. You'd literally feed the hose in and it comes out magically at the other end. But there are still some out there that don't have that. So you literally have a hole, like an entrance port and an exit port. And getting the hose to go in and out at the other end in the right place can be a bit of a headache. Now, if your bike is like this, I strongly recommend you get hold of one of these internal cable route kits, whether you borrow one or you buy one, if you can warrant it. It is such a good bit of kit, and really it's so simple, which is probably the key to it working so well. Now essentially all it is various different size inner cables with different fittings on the end, and you pass these cables through with a really powerful magnet from the outside of the frame, feed them through the frame, and then you attach them to the brake hose and you pull the hose back through using this. It's so simple and it's a really effective system. So if you're doing that, I do recommend trying to get hold of one of these. Otherwise, you might be swearing a bit. Okay, tools for the job. You're obviously going to need the relevant brake. Now be very careful when you open your brake. You'll find on the inside there'll be a little clear packet. You'll need the contents of this. So there's a disc brake pad spacer. You're going to need to install that between the pads. You look very carefully, you'll find there's a little barb in there, a little barbed hose insert. That is to go on the inside of the hose once you've trimmed it down. There's an olive and a little rubber sheath as well. So you have to have those in order to trim the hose down. You'll also find there's one of these little hose clamps on there. So that can help you with the process of trimming that hose down. Although to be fair, there is a much better and easier way of doing it. Now, whilst you can clamp the hose in a vise with this and trim it with a knife and get a pretty good effect, what you're aiming to do is trim the hose completely 90 degrees flush in order for the barb to have a completely water and airtight seal. And really, you won't beat the dedicated tool for the job. There's loads of different options on the market. Shimano make their own one, SRAM make one, and of course Park make one. So you can both trim the hose here, and you also have a little clamp at the end dedicated to put the insert straight in with a little mini clamp that holds the hose. Now, if you work on brakes quite a lot, it is worthwhile getting one of these tools. If not, like I said, you can get by using the supplied stuff, but just take care because cutting that hose, it has to be a really good cut at 90 degrees. Otherwise, you can't guarantee really good performance from your brakes. You're obviously going to need some Allen keys depending on the setup of your bike. For a Shimano brake, you need a 4mm to put the clamp on the bars. You need a 2.5mm on these Fox forks in order to have the hose clamp there. You need a 5mm to put the actual caliper on, and you're going to need an 8mm spanner at the lever end there. Finally, the last thing you're going to need, for this job at least, is some Shimano mineral fluid and a bleed kit. You'll obviously need the relevant kit depending on what brakes you have. If you've got SRAM brakes, you'll need dot fluid and of course the SRAM bleed kit. If you're using Magura brakes, you'll need the Royal Blood, which is blue, and their relevant kit, etc, etc. Now, before you get started, you just need to make sure you have all of the correct parts, and the brakes, of course, are going to fit and be compatible with your bike and your wheels. Now, just something to note is that this particular set of brakes has come with the hose actually attached to the caliper, and it's pre-filled, and it has a rubber sealed cap over the end there. The lever is also pre-filled, and it has a cap on the end there, which means when I can trim this down, effectively, there should be minimal fluid loss because of the way the system is bought. However, it's not always the case. Sometimes they will come complete and you're going to have to break that seal, in which case you will at least need to do a lever bleed to make sure there's no air in the system. And other times they come with the caliper, the lever and the hose as separate entities, and therefore you're definitely going to need to bleed the system. So just take that into account. If it's above your skill level, you might not want to do this. Okay, so there's two more factors you need to look into. One of them is the type of disc rotor that you're going to fit onto your bike. There's two major types. There's a 6-bolt system, which, as you'd imagine, has 6 bolts to mount it to a 6-bolt hub. Very much the standard that you'll see across the board. But there's also the center lock system. Now, it's very common with Shimano brakes, for example, and DT hubs. So just check to make sure you've got the right rotor to suit whatever you're having on your bike. One other thing that's really important to say is never hold the actual braking surface itself. Any oils in residue in your skin can transfer to that, and that can be enough to contaminate the pads. So always hold them by the center of the rotor, and preferably, if you can, use some sort of gloves just to be sure. And the last thing is to make sure you have the relevant brake adapter if you need one. Now, frames and forks have different compatibility with different size disc rotors, and it's not uncommon for a fork, for example, to have a maximum size rotor and a minimum size rotor you can actually fit on there. Quite often you will need a small adapter in order to fit one on. So for example, to fit a 180mm rotor on here, I do need this tiny little adapter. If I was running a 160, you could bolt one straight on. As soon as we have the wheel here, we're going to go with installing the disc rotor first. Pretty simple affair. This one, as I say, is a 6-bolt. Make sure you just nestle it in place. And then using a Torx T25, loosely to start with, just get all of the bolts in to make sure everything lines up. You don't want to put any stress on the threads, particularly if you have like an expensive hub on there. If possible, always use fresh bolts because they come with thread lock already on them. And do take care that you've got the orientation of the disc the correct way. Now, this disc actually has rotation written on it, so you can see here, it'll tell me which orientation it's supposed to be in. But it's actually quite obvious because of the design. It's not always that obvious, so just double check with yours. Now the next step, it doesn't matter if you do the lever first or the caliper. I'm going to do the lever because my gear lever is hanging down, and this particular one has got an I-spec mount on it, so it's compatible with this brake lever. So I'm just going to mount that onto the lever there, so both of them then can go onto the bars. Now something to note with Shimano levers in particular is that the lever clamp on them has a little locking system on there. There's a little pin here that you can push and it unlocks the cradle there to fully open it. So just take care, and as you do that you have to remove the 4mm bolt. There's actually a tiny little O-ring just between them, so just take care you don't lose that. Now let's get to work on getting the caliper in place. Now if you've got one of these pad spacers, just get this in between the brake pads. Saves hassle if you accidentally push the lever at some point in the process. And now I want to get the caliper mounted onto the post mounts on the fork. Now make sure that you have the relevant bolts that will have come with the adapter required for you, and make sure the adapter is in the correct orientation. If you're unsure, there's usually a marking on there that tells you which way is up. Just take care with that. Get the caliper on, nip it up. You don't want it tight because you want to be able to move the caliper in order to make sure the brake pads aren't rubbing on that disc rotor at a later stage. And then the final thing we'll do before you ride the bike is a bolt check to make sure everything's safe. So don't tighten it at this stage. So you want to get your hose routing absolutely nailed. Now for the optimum braking and the ease of maintenance, you want your hoses to be as short as possible, but you don't want them to hinder any movement on the bike. In particular, if it's a rear brake line, you want to be able to turn your bars a certain amount without any strain on there. You don't want it to be pulling on the actual brake levers themselves. For example, if you have a crash, if the front wheel whips around, it pulls the brake line out, you're out of brakes. So make sure that everything is not going to foul anywhere. Now with the front brake, you definitely want to make sure the brake hose runs on the inside of the fork, not the outside. If you catch your fork on anything or you crash, you could actually crimp the brake hose against a rock, for example, and split that. So you want to run it up the inside to where the hose guide goes on the actual fork arch there, and then the neatest route possible through to your actual brake lever. Now before you actually trim anything down, make sure you're leaving enough for room for a longer travel fork, or perhaps a higher rise bar, or if you wanted to run your stem a bit higher, you want to leave it for the longest possible case that you could have on there. At the moment I've got a nearly 40mm rise bar and I've got 3 spaces under my stem. I'm not going to go any higher, so this is optimum, so I can run it as short as I can to get a good curve without straining the hose, and it will be super neat. An added benefit is it looks neater, it makes less noise as well. The longer your hoses are, the more chances of them just tapping on each other. Now there's one other thing that factors in here, and it's called the banjo fitting, and that's on the back of the actual caliper itself. Now if you undo the 4mm bolt just the tiniest bit, you don't want to let any fluid out of here, we're talking just loosen it, you can then move that banjo fitting, and what that enables is you to get rid of that arc. You can actually have it leaving the caliper at a much neater angle, and actually technically it makes it a shorter routing as well. So you want to get this as neat as possible. The same goes for the back end of the bike. Make sure it's exiting the caliper and it's making its way to the frame in the shortest possible distance and as neat as possible as well. Obviously with a full suspension bike, just like you're leaving room at the handlebar end, you want to leave enough room for any movement of the back end of the bike. So it's actually quite a good idea to cycle your bike through the travel before you commit to basically shortening your hoses. Now we've got the hose exiting the caliper itself via that banjo at the optimum angle. I just want to make sure I've got the hose routing exactly where I want it before I determine the length of the hose for trimming it down. So I'm going to mount it to the fork arch here using the supplied mounting. Bear in mind, it's a tiny little Allen key here and it's very easy to round that thread out. So this is literally to hold it in place. You don't have to anchor the thing down. Now, depending on the model fork you have, some will have an Allen key fitting like this. Others will have a zip tie fitting here. So if that's what you've got, get involved at this point. Get that in place and then you can make a real accurate cut point for the hose. Okay, so 2 things to take into account before you trim your hose down is making sure it's routed the correct way at the bars here. I'm going to go over the top of my shift hose, which you might think is a bit long, but I've got this set up to allow for a 480-degree bar turn. So in the event of a crash, if the bars spin round, it's not going to damage anything. So I need to reflect that with this setup. So I'm going to run this over the top of that. And then, yeah, all right, I could run it as short as that, which would be super neat and tidy. But if I turn the bars to 180 degrees, it's not going to let them go. So I'm actually going to let the bar go to 180 degrees and see how long the hose needs to be to allow for that. and that is at this point. So that's how much hose I'll have there, which still looks nice and neat. So I'm going to put a sticker there just to give me a little marking where I need to make my trim. Now at this point, if you don't have one of these dedicated hose cutters, you're going to need to remove the caliper from the bike with your trusty marking there, and do this in a vise using the cable clamp. However, I've got this, so I'm going to do it whilst it's on the bike here. Now, something just to accentuate here, this will be slightly different depending on the manufacturer of brakes. On the end of here, there will be an insert on the end of this hose. I can't reuse that, so when I trim this, I'm going to need to reinstall a new insert there. Now this bit is really important. Because of the fact you need to have the little rubber sheath that goes over the end, this needs to go on first before you put the insert in and before you have that 8mm nut and the olive there, because otherwise you can't get this on afterwards. If you think about the order, looking at this brake here, you can see you have the nut, then you have the olive that goes in and makes that seal, and then you have the barb that sits into the end of the hose. So just make sure you get the order of things correct at this stage. Now, because the brake lever is pre-filled with brake fluid, I want to give it the least chance of any coming out. So I'm actually just going to loosen the clamp off and just raise this up. So I'm going to have to undo this in order to use this nut on the hose. And I just don't want to risk any more oil coming out of here than absolutely necessary. As I said, you need to make this as 90 degrees as possible. By using a tool like this, it definitely helps. It's not to say that you can't do it without, it just makes it easier. So again, note the order. Rubber sheath goes on first, then goes on the threaded nut and the olive that are complete together. Last piece of the puzzle is for the insert to go inside. Now, you won't be able to push these in by hand like this, so what you need to do is use the relevant tool. Okay, so now, literally a case of inserting this into the lever, and carefully slide that into place. Now, one thing to pay attention to when you're securing this 8mm nut, it can turn the hose. Now, it won't make too much difference with your front brake routing, but it'll make a massive difference with the rear routing if it twists the hose. So just be sure that you don't let the hose twist as you're tightening this in. And this does need to be tightened all the way in because it compresses the olive. Whole job of it, the brass olive, is to compress and not let anything past it. And the last stage is to just slide the rubber cover over the top. Okay, so we've trimmed down the hose successfully, but we still don't know if we're going to need to bleed the lever yet. There could still be a tiny bit of air in there from when we trimmed the hose down. So what we're going to do is remove the pad spacer from the caliper. We're going to install the front wheel. We're going to set the caliper up so it's not dragging, and then we're going to see how the lever feels. If it's pulling too far towards the handlebars, it does suggest it does need a little top up of fluid at the lever end there. We'll deal with that in a minute, so let's get the wheel on first. Okay, so I'm going to kind of do two things at the same time here. I want to see if the caliper's dragging and also feel the lever, see if I'm going to need to bleed it. So it is dragging, and the lever is going a little bit towards the bar, so I probably will top up the fluid. In the meantime, if you hold the brake lever on, and then you can just nip up the bolts on the caliper, and you should find most times that will be centered or near enough centered. You might need to fine tune it from here, and I would definitely go back and check the bolts afterwards. Okay, so now I'm just going to remove the front wheel once more and return the pad spacer in there, making sure those pads are spread apart as they should be. And then I'm going to attach the bleeding cup to the lever there, and then hopefully you'll see just a few air bubbles pop out, and that's probably all it needs at this stage to get your brake feeling absolutely spot on. Okay, with the pad spacer in place, it's up to the lever to remove this little Allen bolt from the top, giving access to the master cylinder there. Now, when you install the cup into there, a couple of things to observe. It's only got a plastic thread on here, so make sure you line it up and don't over tighten it. It has got an O-ring there to form a seal. It's supposed to be a delicate process. And make sure the plunger is fully sent home, because the next step you're going to do is fill some oil into here, and then the whole point of this is you remove the plunger, and then hopefully any air bubbles that have got to the top of the system here will just migrate through there, replaced by oil when you pump the lever. And you just tighten it till it stops. There, no more. Plunger is in place, so now I'm just going to top up in here with some fresh mineral fluid. Okay, so what we want to do here is just tap that brake line and see if anything immediately comes out. There you go, one little bubble. And then we're just going to give the lever a little pump, and you'll probably see a couple of bubbles come out here. Not much more coming out. And the lever feels good. Feels just like the existing back brake on there. So that's it, that's all this brake needed. So now you replace that plunger. And then very carefully remove the cup off the lever. Now it's very easy to spill some of the fluid, but thankfully mineral fluid isn't too corrosive to your paint surfaces, but it could still get near other braking surfaces, so do take care when you do that. I'd recommend putting a rag or something around the bars to try and catch this. And then you want to get that bolt back in place as swiftly as possible. So have that ready. And then the cup can come off, and make sure that the bolt has still got the olive on there. That's your little seal, your little O-ring. Now you will get a tiny bit of overspill just as that nips up. Now ideally you want to use some isopropyl alcohol or some disc brake cleaner just to get rid of that residue around your brake there. Okay, so back down to the front wheel. I'm just going to remove that pad spacer once more. Just carefully remove that. Put the wheel back in place, and we're going to check that feel of the brake again, and then double check to make sure the caliper isn't rubbing and it's doing what we want it to, essentially, and repeat if necessary. Okay, so it's not dragging, that's a good thing. I'm happy with that. The brake feels exactly as it should do, and I've still got further adjustments I can make at the lever blade there for lever travel and how far away it is from the bars. Last thing to do, and most importantly, is a full bolt check. Now obviously I shouldn't have to remind you, a brake is a safety item, so check and double check the caliper bolts, check your disc rotor bolts, check your hose clamps, and make sure the brake lever is in a position that suits your riding style and is tight enough that it's not going to move around like this one does currently. Yeah, so get everything dialed in nicely, and then you can go and hit the trails. That's all it is. It's pretty simple fitting a brake as long as you follow a basic principle. Most modern mountain bikes have hydraulic disc brakes on board, which offer excellent power and consistency. But to keep them that way, a routine bleed will be needed from time to time. So in today's video, we're going to go through everything you need to know about disc brakes, how they work, all the things that can affect them, and more importantly, everything you need to know to bleed your brakes. There are loads of different brands and models of disc brake available on the market, each of them having slightly different setup options and slightly different variations on the way that you bleed them. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at all of them, a bit of an overview so you can understand what it is you need to do to get air out of your system and to bleed your brakes thoroughly. Okay, let's have an overview of a brake, just so you can understand what each component does. Now, I've got a handy cutaway option here. This one is a SRAM lever, but the same things apply to many brakes on the market. So starting with the lever, ignoring the fact the clamp is missing on this one, the clamp would actually look like this lever here. So you have your lever blade, I'm sure that's familiar to everyone, and you have the pivot in which it moves around. This one, as you can see quite clearly, has a bearing there. You might notice there's a little dial on the top here. This is the lever reach adjust. So that's responsible for moving the lever in relation to the handlebars, but not in relation to the piston on the inside. So if you have big hands, you can dial it to be far away, small hands, close to the bars. You won't always have a dial like this. Sometimes you have to access a small, well, very small Allen key head hidden underneath. You might also notice there's a little dial on here. This one is for adjusting the bite point of the actual pad. So it's like a micro adjust for moving the pads closer or further away from the disc rotor. Now, not all brakes have this feature, and the brakes that do have slightly different variations on the dial. Hope brakes, for example, have 2 dials that look like this one on the lever. Shimano ones have a 3-stroke adjust, which is actually a screw head on there. Now, if I flip the lever around, you're going to be able to see the piston on the inside. The piston is what actuates the whole system. So as you move the lever, it pushes the piston and it pushes the fluid down the line into the caliper at the other end. You can also see, if you look closely, when I make the adjustment on the actual reach adjust, it just moves that piston slightly. So it just changes the position at the other end there. The next thing to look at on the lever is the actual reservoir on the top here. Now, if you look at this one on the side on, you'll see underneath the cap of it, there's a little rubber diaphragm. Now, this is what makes the system an open system. Now, all modern mountain bike disc brakes use an open system, and it doesn't mean there's holes in there and, rain and stuff can get in. What it refers to really is the fact there's 2 little vent holes on the top here and a diaphragm with some room between the cap and the diaphragm itself. As you use your disc brake, heat is generated, the fluid gets hot and will expand slightly. So this is to allow, as you can see here, it moves around, is to allow for fluid expansion, and those holes literally just atmospherically allowing that to do so without hampering the feeling of the brake. If those holes weren't there and the diaphragm wasn't there, what would happen as the fluid expands is it has nowhere to go. So instead of having a lever that feels like this, it will pump up and the lever will barely move. Next up is the bleed port. Now, most brake levers have a bleed port. We're going to show you a couple that don't have them a bit later on in the video. And a bleed port is quite simply your access point for getting fluid in and out of that system. This lever actually has one on both sides because it's what we call a flip-flop lever. So you can use it on either side of the bars accordingly, and it means you don't have to mess around with it too much with bleeding. But levers that are not a flip-flop design, like the Shimano one or this TRP one, have a single bleed port. The last thing you need to know about is the hose attachment. So your brake hose will go straight into the lever at this point, and on the end of the actual hose itself, you will have a barbed fitting that goes into the end of the actual brake line, and then you have an olive attachment, which is a compression fitting. So you screw it into the lever, it compresses, so no fluid or air can go in or out at that point. And then you have the caliper end. So firstly, you have your 2 mount points, which basically mount it onto the frame or to an adapter to allow for different disc rotor sizes. The next point you'll probably notice will be where the actual brake hose comes into the caliper. This fitting is known as a banjo fitting because it kind of looks like a banjo, and you can move it to multiple positions to get really good routing for it. Next up, looking from the top down, you can see the actual pin that runs through here and the brake pads on the inside. Now, if I flip it over, you're going to get another view of those brake pads and the inside of the caliper. So as you can see, where the brake line comes in, the fluid will go down these channels behind these pistons here, which drive onto the actual brake pads and compress them. At the bottom end, you'll see there's a bleed port. The bleed port has those same channels, and obviously you can flush fluid in and out in both directions in order to get good fluid in, bad fluid out, and get the air out. No surprise, there's going to be lots of places you can harbour the bad stuff in there. Now, when you look at the pistons close up, you've got little rubber seals around them. Those rubber seals need to be nice and lubricated, as do the pistons, in order to do their job correctly. Those little rubber seals are actually responsible for pulling the pistons back, like retracting them into the body. And this particular caliper has 4 pistons, also known as 4 pots. You can get anything from 2 pistons up to 6 pistons on some model of brakes. Okay, so where exactly can air get into the system, given that it's a sealed system? Well, you've got to start with the first things first. When you actually assemble the system, if it comes in different components, air can get in at that point. It can also get in when you trim the brake hoses down. As you trim them down, you have to fit this new barbed fitting into the end. And if you haven't trimmed the hose in exactly a 90-degree angle for a flush fitting of that barb fitting, you guessed it, air can get in and out at that point. It has to be a perfect cut every time. And of course, you must use the correct compression olive. They all look very similar, but they're all slightly different depending on the particular brake you're using. If in doubt, don't use it, and double check, because there's a lot of different orientations available on the market to suit different models. Of course, when it goes into the actual brake lever itself, it needs to be tightened sufficiently. If there's any chance of a leak, fluid can come out and air can get in there. And then of course there's the bleeding process. Doesn't matter which way you bleed it, whether it's a bucket and you're bleeding top down or syringes and you're bleeding bottom up, you can push air into the system using those syringes and air can get in from the bucket. If you haven't had enough amount of fluid in there, you're not been paying attention when you're bleeding the system, air can literally get straight in there. So it's down to you to make sure your system is as air-free as possible. Now also don't forget, there's loads of places that air can be harboured in the system. As I've shown you with these cutaways, look at the back of the pistons here. It's no surprise you can find the occasional bubble tapped in there. And I've known people that have sworn their brakes have been bled correctly, but you manage to still get air bubbles out of them. So sometimes you do need to bleed several times, unfortunately. Some brakes can be more prone to it than others, but a bit of persistency will pay off for you. And the same goes for the lever bleed as well. Now, something to bear in mind with the levers in particular when you're doing the lever bleed is your bleed port is in a different position in different brakes. Even from the same manufacturer, it can be a different position. You have to make sure the reservoir is underneath where that port is. Otherwise, you're not going to get a good bleed and it will still harbour some air in there. So do take care. Certain brakes, like Shimano, for example, suggest that you run the brake lever about a 45-degree angle initially, but then when you're completing the lever bleed, you actually move it backwards and forwards a couple of times just to make sure there's no air in there. And the last two things you need to factor in, of course, with air in the system is perished seals. So if you've got a dot fluid brake, for example, and it's not been ridden for some time, it will have ingested moisture in there, and the moisture can damage the seals and cause corrosion on the inside, all sorts of stuff. So old brakes generally will need a bleed to make sure they're working nicely again. And then if you've been hammering your bike and you've boiled the brakes, you will have air bubbles in the system, because as it vaporizes, you'll get some tiny air bubbles present, and that nice firm feeling brake from compressing hard fluid on the inside there turns into a mushy, horrible brake where you're compressing air instead. I'm sure we've all felt that at times. Okay, to bleed your brakes, you're going to need a bleed kit. Now, the obvious thing would be to have a specific bleed kit for your brakes, i.e. a SRAM bleed kit if you've got SRAM brakes, or a Magura kit for Magura brakes. But you can get overall kits that will suit multiple different brakes with different fittings and attachments. The most important thing that you take into account, whichever kit and whichever way you're going to do it, is that you have one that suits the correct fluid. So there's two major systems. You get dot fluid and you get mineral fluid, and neither are compatible. If you have a bike that has dot fluid and also you have another bike that's got mineral, you're going to need two separate sets of fluid and two separate sets of kits. You do not want to mix these together at all. And in addition to the actual relevant bleed kits for your particular brakes, you'll need some protective glasses just in case. None of the oils are good to go anywhere near your eyes for obvious reasons. You want some protective gloves. Not only are they good to protect the skin on your hands, but actually help you a bit of dexterity to actually grip some of the stuff when it gets slippy with the actual fluid as well. And I recommend making sure before you start you've got the relevant Allen keys, Torx keys, and any other additional tools that are specific to your particular system. Okay, so the age-old argument with disc brakes then is which fluid is better? Well, the simple thing is they have dot fluid and mineral fluid, and both of them are excellent choices for use in mountain bike brakes. So whatever you've got decent brakes, so don't worry about that. But the fluids themselves have slightly different properties, and it's good to know about these just so you can act accordingly with your particular system in looking after and maintaining your brakes. Now let's have a look at DOT first, or DOT. DOT stands for Department of Transportation, and that's because it's a regulated fluid. It's used in the motor industry, and it's regulated because it has to perform at certain temperatures, both high and low. So you could ultimately say that this is a very good high performance liquid. Now, the issues you get with using DOT are A, it's excellent for using on brakes. However, you do need to maintain it, and it basically has a shelf life that comes with that. So high performance, but you do need to look after it accordingly. Now, the fluid itself is hygroscopic, which means over time, through microscopic holes in the brake lines and anywhere else in the system, it's going to ingest moisture. And DOT fluid can actually ingest 2% of its volume in your system in just a year. So it will need some care to make sure they're bled correctly. This is also a reason why, when you have DOT fluid, we always recommend having a small container rather than having a big workshop spec one. Unless you're bleeding like hundreds of brakes at a time, you want to have a small amount of this, because the shelf life really is going to be around a year for something like this. It will vary depending on the storage conditions, how damp the room is, things like that. But ultimately, if there's any moisture in the brakes, that's what's going to affect them. Now, dot fluid has a very high boiling temperature, 270 degrees Celsius on average, extremely high. However, that goes down to about 190 degrees centigrade as soon as you get any moisture on the inside there. So your brakes will be hampered if there's any interference with that. So if you've got a bike, for example, that you've not ridden for some time that's got dot brakes on it, there's a good chance you're going to need to bleed those brakes and have some fresh fluid on there. Now, the fluid itself is slightly corrosive. Now, it doesn't mean it's like a crazy acid or anything, but what that means is it can be damaging to paintwork on your frame. It's obviously not damaging to the brake components. It's also why we recommend wearing gloves and a pair of eyewear when you're actually working on the bike. And next up, mineral fluid. Now, this stuff is not regulated. Now, as a result, you get loads of different variations, loads of different types, and each one is different. So if you're going to buy dot fluid for your brakes, for example, there tends to be 4 or 5.1 that you have in your mountain bike brakes. You can mix them together and you can buy any brand. They're all going to perform as stated. Mineral fluids all have slightly different things because it's not regulated. Now, you could look at this and think, well, dot must be better because it's regulated. Not necessarily true. The freedom that the designers have of working with a fluid that's not regulated means they can have their own formula that is best suited to their seals, their brakes, their calipers, their pistons, their entire systems. So Shimano naturally will recommend using their fluid with their system, Magura recommends using their fluid with their system, etc, etc. Now, the fluid boiling point does vary massively on mineral fluid compared to dot fluid, which, as we know, is about 270. So you're talking anything from 190 degrees Celsius all the way up to about 290. So a huge variety there, but also it's still going to be affected by water that's ingested into the system. But it is a little bit different because this fluid is hydrophobic. It's not hygroscopic like the dot stuff. What that means is when water gets into the system, it's not going to sort of get into the fluid itself. It's actually going to pull separately. The downside to this is it's going to pull at the nearest point, which will be your caliper. And of course, if you've got water down at the caliper, it's obviously going to boil, turn into air. Obviously not ideal down there. But the upside to that means it's really easy to get it out, flush it out of the system. So not necessarily a bad thing at that point. Now, one of the great things about mineral oil and why many brands tend to use it is it doesn't go off as such. Because it's hydrophobic, it doesn't ingest moisture. You can get a big workshop spec one of these, which is great value to have if you've got multiple bikes and you like to bleed your brakes and stuff. The oil's not going to go off, and it's also great if you've got various bikes or you don't ride that frequently. Your brakes are going to stay feeling good. They will obviously need routine bleeding just like dot ones, but it's not going to be quite so sensitive in terms of the fact that moisture gets in to affect the actual fluid in itself. And the last thing to take into account is mineral fluid is not corrosive. Granted, you don't want to get this anywhere near your eyes, you shouldn't get this on your skin, and you need to dispose of it accordingly. So all brake fluids, no matter whether they're mineral or dot, speak to your local recycling centre and they'll tell you the quantities you can get rid of it in and how to do so safely. The bottom line is with both fluids, with both dot and mineral, is that they are both affected by fluid getting in the line. It's going to degrade the performance of the brakes. You can end up with air in the system and inconsistent braking. That is what you do not want to have. Okay, so let's look at the fundamentals of bleeding a brake because the principle is basically the same for all brakes. Now, there will be some slight nuances to each individual system that is slightly different, and we're going to delve into some of the most common options on the market that you probably have on your bikes at home. But first, let's do an overview on bleeding a brake. Preparation is key, so the first thing you want to make sure you do is prepare your lever first. Now, your lever will have some form of adjustment. It might just have reach, or it might have a bite point adjustment as well. So if you've got a bite point adjustment, you want to undo this, you want to unwind it as much as possible. And then the same goes for the lever reach adjustment. No matter what the brand you're using, back these things out. You want to make sure that the lever can take the maximum amount of fluid to achieve a good solid brake bleed. Set your brake lever so the bleed port is the highest possible thing. Now, of course, the bleed ports are all in slightly different places depending on what the brands are, and you've got to make sure that a reservoir is under the port. It's not always that obvious. Sometimes the lever will be horizontal, other times like this one will be about a 30-degree angle. Next up is removing the pads. So remove the pin and make sure when you remove the pads you can't contaminate them. So keep them separately away from any oils or any part of the bleed system. Next up, you want to put your bleed block in. This basically stops the piston moving so you can get the correct amount of fluid in the system. Now you might need multiple bleed blocks depending on the model of brakes. These Magura ones, you need 2 in place. These ones from SRAM, you need a single one in place. Now the sizing of these is different depending on the model and the brand, so just make sure you have the correct one for your fitting. And the last thing to do is get the correct fluid in your syringes. Make sure there's no air bubbles present in the actual tubes. Next up, attach the syringe to the caliper and to the brake lever. Your particular brake might have a bucket design, which we're going to deal with a little bit later in the video. Your brake could be a bleed from the top down to the caliper, or it could be from the caliper to the top. That's really the fundamental thing that changes between the different systems. So again, we're going to run you through the most common options out there. Next step is to pressurize the lever. Now, if your system has an open bucket design on the top as part of the bleeding, you want to hold the lever in place near the bar using a toe strap or something similar. The idea is it pressurizes the system and you remove a small amount of oil from the system, allowing the oil to pull back in again at the top. So make sure you've got a really good firm lever. If your system is using syringe at the lever end, you actually create a vacuum to achieve a similar thing. Flicking the lever is very common at this point while the system is still open to remove any air bubbles that can be trapped in the lever, and you might need to move the lever up and down depending on the model just to make sure you've removed any trapped air. Last steps are to close the system and give it a clean, and if you need to, repeat. Okay, now for bleeding any brake. Well, there's loads of different brands out there. We're going to deal with the major ones that you're likely to see spec'd on bikes. Now, of course, there's lots of different models. We're talking in general here, and let's go with Shimano first. Now, Shimano brakes use mineral fluid. The usual method uses a bucket at the lever and a syringe at the caliper, but you can use a syringe at both ends. The bleed process is bottom to top and then back down, and you pressurize the lever using a strap and opening the bleed port quickly. Air can get trapped in the lever, so it's advised to move the lever back and forth a few times just to make sure the air is removed. SRAM brakes use DOT fluid inside. Brakes from 2017 onwards use the bleeding edge bleed port, which is absolutely brilliant. Use the syringe at both ends and you bleed top to bottom. Closing the bleed port before removing the bottom syringe makes this process very easy. You create a vacuum on the top syringe to pressurize the lever. Magura. These brakes use mineral fluid and they can use syringes at both ends or a bucket at the lever end. You bleed bottom to top and then back down through the system. You close the caliper and you pull the lever to introduce pressure and migrate any lever air bubbles out, closing the system to finish. Hope brakes use DOT fluid. The usual method is to open the top reservoir on the lever and use a syringe at the caliper. You bleed them top to bottom in the same way that you would with motorcycle brakes. You top up the fluid in the reservoir and then you close the system at the end. You can also use a bucket at the lever to make for easier filling. The reservoir on the lever is quite small and you do need to monitor it when filling, as if it runs dry, you will directly pull air into the lines. The bucket system means you can have much more oil available to you here to pull into the system. TRP. These brakes use mineral fluid and there's 2 methods to bleeding them depending on the model. You can have the bleed cup at a lever and the syringe at the bottom, or you can have syringes top and bottom. You bleed them bottom to top with a push-pull style. Use a lever strap to pressurize the lever, much like you would with Shimano, and you open and close the bleed nipple at the bottom, watching the fluid level at the lever. Haze. These brakes use DOT fluid and use syringes top and bottom. You bleed them bottom to top and then return back through the system. You add the vacuum at the lever using a syringe, and the newer models actually have 2 bleed ports on the caliper for a further bleed to ensure 0 air in the system. Very cool, and it also means that it's very good if you need to service the caliper to ensure a tight bleed. Okay, and of course, with all systems, there's going to be a few tips and tricks, and I'm sure many of you will have discovered your own individual tips and tricks that have nothing to do with the manuals that just help you when you've got those air bubbles you can't quite get out of the system. Here's a few that we tend to use here at GMBN. Classic one, tapping the hose. Get a spanner, a small one, and just tap the hose when you're flicking the lever, or sometimes when you're pushing the fluid through the system. Can really help, especially if you've got any kinks in your brake line there. It can help the air migrate through it. Obviously, you want to make sure that the air has the best possible chance of getting to the top. So if you have got any curves in those cables and hoses, make sure it's as straight as possible to help the air find its way out to the top. Always make sure your brake caliper is lower than the reservoir, which is on the lever. This is easy when you're doing your front brake, but sometimes when you're bleeding your rear brake because the rear caliper is at the back of the bike, the weight of your bike in a stand will actually move it and your caliper can end up higher than the actual lever. This wreaks havoc. So just pay attention to that. If you have problems with air in the systems and you've got a bucket style system, you can actually leave these open for some time. You can strap the lever, pull it to the bar, make sure your caliper end is closed and you can leave the lever end open. Tap your way up the hose and you might just find just that one little annoying air bubble just migrates its way out by itself. The good point about having the bucket there is as that air bubble migrates out, fluid's going to replace the space it had on the inside of the line. And the last one is your bite point adjustment, whether you have a dial or something on your actual levers for manually adjusting it, or it's an automatic system on yours. It's going to be affected by the condition and how clean your brake calipers are. So as with anything on the bike, you should be cleaning them. With your brake calipers, think of what's happening. The pistons are moving in and out the whole time. If they're dried up and they're all dusty and dirty, they might not be sliding and retracting back into the actual caliper properly. What you want to do is lubricate them. Now, if your bike has dot fluid brakes, use dot fluid to lubricate them. If your bike has mineral fluid brakes, use mineral fluid. What you want to do is literally just pull your brake lever just to expose those pistons slightly. Take care, you don't want them to pop out, and just use a brush or something small just to get a tiny bit of oil in place and then push them back in place. Pull them out again, push them back in place, and you'll find that they retract the correct amount at that point. It's one of the things you can do if your bike is suffering from the pads rubbing, for example. That's a classic sign that you've been riding for a long time and everything's a bit grubby, it's not just working as it should do. Okay, so a bit of theory, a bit of practice, a bit of information about disc brakes. Hopefully there's some points in this video that can help you understand your brakes and to get the best out bleeding them.
Tubeless tyres. Have you drunk in the Kool-Aid? Do you believe the hype about how good they are, or do you hate setting up tubeless tyres? We're going to give you lots of tricks, lots of tips on how to set up your wheels tubeless. Okay, before we get started, we're going to run through all the things you'll need to go tubeless. For your tubeless conversion, you'll need a tubeless ready tyre, tubeless ready rim, tubeless rim tape, a tubeless valve with a removable valve core, a tubeless sealant, a plastic tyre lever, and a track pump. Hopefully we all know by now that the mountain bike industry and the term standards is, well, there's not very many shared standards. And unfortunately, tyres and rims are in that bracket where there's some variation. With tubeless, you need to make sure that your rim profile is tubeless ready and the tyre is tubeless ready as well. There's a couple of different standards out there already. So there's the UST, which is Universal System Tubeless, which was set up by rim manufacturer and some tyre manufacturers about 20 years ago. And that defined a very specific rim profile and bead profile on the tyre. And originally it was designed to be used without sealant. And it relied on the tyre being airtight. And it was a good system. It's still out there and you can still get UST tyres. You might not need them, but you will need tubeless ready tyres and rims, and that specifically is in relation to the bead and how tight it is and how sort of square the profile is, so how it fits with your tyres. Don't be tempted to use non-tubeless ready tyres or rims because, well, at worst it could pop off and make a really loud bang. I guess at worst in the workshop it can make a really loud bang and you get covered in tyre sealant, which is a bit messy, but not too bad, and definitely not as messy as if the tyre pops off the rim while you're heading down a rocky descent, where if it pops off, well, yeah, your front wheel will stop really, really quickly and it can get very messy very quickly. So make sure you use tubeless ready rims and tubeless ready tyres. Wheels and rim profiles are core to tubeless setup, and originally the UST system defined a really defined rim profile, so it's kind of like the wavy section in the middle and also the kind of the section where the bead bites on the rim edge. It also defined or made lots of brands use really proprietary and unique ways of making the rim bed sealed. Thankfully, lots of brands have moved away from this proprietary, clever tech and I've just gone with simple tape because tape works, it's replaceable and it's customizable, which we'll go into a bit more detail later. Whilst the UST rim systems defined a special bead lock system, lots of brands have started to move to a hookless rim profile. Some of that's to save a little bit of weight, some of it's to make this bead edge here a little bit tougher, but one thing it means is that it's not relying on a hook to hold the bead in place on the tyre, so it means it's essential that you use the correct tyre, so tubeless ready. Don't try and bodge it with a non-tubeless ready, especially on hookless. So, rim tape. Without having the sealed bed of lots of UST systems, rim tape is the way forward now for tubeless setups. Lots of brands of wheels have their own proprietary tape. Lots of it's quite similar. I'll say, yeah, electrical tape might look similar, but it's not suitable. It doesn't take the load, because think about when your tyre's under pressure, it's quite a lot of pressure. So yeah, it might be nice to use electrical tape, but it doesn't really work. In a pinch, you could use Gorilla Tape. It's quite thick, it's quite bulky, it leaves a bit of a sticky residue, and it's kind of hard to see how many layers you've got. And we'll come on to why you need to see how many layers there are a bit later. But we've got this stuff from PT's. It's nice and elastic, so it goes on quite easily, and key, it's clear, so you can easily see how many layers you've got on the tape. Why, might you ask? Is it important to know why there's multiple layers or not multiple layers? Okay, so now we've moved away from UST and we're using this kind of coverall of tubeless ready. There's subtle variations between the rim manufacturers and the tyre manufacturers and the beads, and it means that sometimes on some rims with some tyre combinations you'll need more than just 1.5 laps or wraps of tape, and you'll need a couple more. So having clear tape means that it's really easy to see, okay, cool, I've got 1.5 or I've got 2 wraps of tape on this rim, and from experience and a little technique which I'll show you later on, you'll be able to realise, okay, for this rim in particular I need maybe up to 4 wraps of tape. So having a clear tape like the PT's is a really good advantage. You might think a valve is a valve, and essentially they are, but there's some subtle features and useful features that are pretty much essential when you're converting to tubeless. So one of them is that you might have a good cone-shaped rubber fitting, so that means that it will fit into the rim bed, and there's a couple of different rims that need unique ones, but most of the time a kind of good cone-shaped one like this will work really well. The other key feature that is pretty much essential is a removable valve core. And it's key because sometimes some tyre setups you'll need to get the maximum airflow in, so you'll have to remove the valve core. Other times it's more for a maintenance thing. So if you take the valve core out, you'll be able to actually check how much sealant you've got in there, which is something you probably need to do a bit more often than you do already. Sealant by their very nature are designed to seal holes, and well, a valve is a hole and it can get air in, so sometimes they can gum up. And again, with a removable valve core, it means you can give it a clean, take it apart, and keep your tubeless setup set up. Tubeless tyres. These are key in a tubeless setup. You might wonder why, in terms of if you've got the sealant and you've got a rim bed that's sealed, why you'd need a special tyre as well. Most of that comes down to the bead. So the beads need to be stronger, they need to be made to a tighter tolerance, so that's why you have to ensure that you're getting the tubeless ready or UST standard tyres, and that's because it will interface with the rim correctly and create an airtight seal. And essentially the bead is the key bit of both these systems, and you want it to be really tight, because if it's not tight you can burp air, and if you can burp air you can lose pressure, and if you lose too much pressure the tyre could come off the rim. So if you get a tubeless ready rim and tubeless ready tyre, that's really going to help. One last factor is that if you're running a non-tubeless ready tyre, the bead won't be as strong, and that's because it's designed to have a tube inside to help hold it against the rim. So with no tube to pinch flat, it means that you can run much lower pressure, which is great. You get loads more traction in pretty much all conditions. Often it actually rolls quicker too. One thing that you should be mindful of though is that some tyres won't have the right strength carcass or sidewall to be run at really low pressures. So some of the cross-country tyres, which are designed to be super light, need to be run at a slightly higher pressure than you might imagine. However, some of the sort of down-country, enduro and tougher trail tyres often have an insert in the sidewall, and that insert offers a little bit more protection against sort of like sidewall cuts and things like that, but it also stiffens up the carcass. So when you're running low pressures, it means that you're less likely to sort of burp, which is where the bead can creep away from the rim And it also just offers more support. So when you're in a turn, it'll hold the tyre up a little bit. So if you're riding more aggressively, or you're doing trail centres, or you're riding anything but XC race, look for a tyre with a little bit of a burlier sidewall to help with that lower pressure riding. This stuff's kind of essential for a tubeless setup. All the modern tubeless ready systems really do need it, and I'd recommend it for any kind of riding, because essentially if you get a thorn in your tyre in a UST system without any sealant, well, you're still going to get a flat, which is a letdown. So the sealant stays wet. It's got lots of different things. The PT ones has a combination of biofibers inside it and these bioplatelets. So it's kind of nice. A couple of other brands are looking at it too, but PTs are really pushing it, which is nice. And that's thinking about that you need these platelets and you need these things in the tyre to help coagulate around any thorns or any cuts to help seal, much like your blood does and the way it clots. But PTs are actually thinking about what happens when this tyre sealant is out of your tyre and on the trail. So all their stuff is actually biodegradable. So it's not going to leave a messy sealant patch there forever. It is going to degrade. With sealants, pretty much all the brands use similar amounts. So for 29er wheels, it's around 100 millilitres. But all the brands have detailed instructions of how much you need for which tyre sizes you need. So that'll depend on both the diameter and the size of tyre that you're running. A tip I've kind of learned as well is if you're running a new rim, new tyre, especially if you're using a new tyre, and especially if it's a tubeless ready versus UST, is actually splash a little bit more in than the brands recommend. And that's, I've found through experience, is that it helps effectively seal the tyre, but then you've still got some actual active sealant sloshing around inside to seal up those holes. If you're living somewhere particularly thorny, or you're going away for a week, again, kind of err on the side of caution and use a little bit more sealant, because some sealant will spurt out as it starts to seal up your tyre. And if you're away for ages and you don't want to take more sealant with you, having a little bit more inside the tyre will mean that you should be flat free. Another advantage of running a tubeless tyre setup is that you can run an insert. An insert, you say, what's he talking about? It's with Vittoria, it's a green foam ring. And essentially it's a closed cell foam ring that sits inside the tyre carcass. And it just creates a protective barrier between the hard object and your rim. They can be really good. It's much, much easier to set up with a tubeless system than with a tube. And they just provide an extra bit of support for the tyre, and I'd say the key thing is protecting your rim. So if you're riding somewhere particularly rocky, then yeah, I think especially on the rear, they're an essential item to stick in. We've got dedicated videos on how to set them up, because there's a couple of different styles out there. But yeah, if you're running tubeless and you like to get rad and gnarly, then run an insert in the rear for peace of mind. Right, time to get messy. Well, actually non-messy with Coots Create's non-patented, no mess tubeless sealant technique. So yeah, hopefully we won't get messy with this dry approach. Your wheel might come with stock tape. For this example, we've taken the tape off. There's probably nothing wrong with it, but for this technique, we want to highlight how you might need to do a couple of wraps or even triple wraps of tape around the rim to make sure that you get the bead and rim edge interface perfect. And that's how this dry technique works really, really well, is that it sort of flags any inconsistencies with the height of the tape that you need and the subtle differences between the different rims and different tyres that you might use. So we'll begin by wrapping 1.5 reels round. Here's the valve hole just here, and we're going to start taping sort of about a quarter of the way around from that to ensure that we've got at least 2 laps of tape on. So we're going to start it off. Just centerise it, and then you're going to have to use quite a lot of effort to stretch the tape into place so it dives right down. Just be careful to hold at least one end whilst you work around. So in terms of how tightly you need to pull it, different tapes have got sort of a different elastic level. So some tapes you can pull on really hard and it'll stretch a tiny bit. Other tapes can't and don't stretch very much at all, so you've just got to be really careful that you're pulling it tight enough that it can seat down into the wheel well. This wheel's quite wide. The rim tape, I probably should have sized up. The rim tapes do come in different thicknesses, and often you'll need to size up on tape. so that it fills, because as you pull it, it kind of narrows and stretches a little bit. But what I'm going to ensure is that we've got one lap of tape all the way around, and then we're going to do a second that covers this rim edge, and then we'll do a third that covers that edge, just to ensure that the whole of the rim bed is covered with tape. We've gone for 3 layers, so we've essentially got one in the center and then one each side. And so we're just going to make a nice, I do it straight. Some people cut the tape at an angle. What I do then is probably not that many people do, and it's a bit nerdy, but I'll basically run my hand and thumb in the central groove and make sure that the tape is seated fully and it's all stuck down. So sometimes you'll hear that's air popping, where I've probably not done the best job ever of putting the tape on, but I'm just going to push out all those air bubbles and make sure that we've got a nice even sort of adhesion to the tape. With different tapes, you might need to use different additional tapes. So with PTs, they've got this nice strip of finishing tape, and that goes over not necessarily the end of the valve, but I found success in it using it over where the valve hole is. So we'll just, again, advantage of the clear tape is that we can see that the valve hole is just here. Other tapes, it is a bit more faffy, so we know where the valve hole is, and we're just gonna stick this finishing strip on. Lots of different people have got different techniques for this. PTs uses just a simple spike tool just to poke a hole in the center. I mean, a quick way of finding the center is sliding it in from the other side, because then you can kind of feel the fabric coming up, and you just slide the hole in and then make it a little bit bigger so that it's nice and even for when the valve goes in. Insert the valve through the hole that we've made. Might need to wiggle it around a little bit and then just push it in. So with PTs, we've then got a rubber O-ring, and then we've got the locking collar. So we've just got to put the rubber on. That helps sort of protect the rim, and then the locking collar helps pull the valve in. So use a fair bit of force on the inside of the rim side to push the valve down in and make sure that rubber grommet is fully seated into the rim bed. Now, it can be easy to sort of like fall into, especially some of these valves. So the PT's one's got this kind of like cruciform shape on, and that's if you use an insert, you need to have space between the valve and any kind of insert that you run to allow airflow. It's kind of tempting to put maybe a screwdriver or an Allen key in and really hunker down on this lock nut. But effectively, that doesn't really help, and you could damage your rim. You could crack it by forcing it too tightly. So I would say use a good amount of force with your thumb just to make sure that lock nut's tight. The rubber grommet is going to be doing the hard work of the sealing, not that little rubber O-ring. So don't go too bananas. Okay, we've unfolded our tyre. We're going to line it up. I would say do check the direction of your tyre. Lots of tyres are directional. What I do is I put the bead in opposite the valve. That gives us a little bit more room to work with. So with a tyre bead sat in the bottom of the rim, try and then just work the bead in around to finish the last bit of bead going on where the valve is, because it should, he says, famous last words, should give you a little bit more space to fit the tyre on. So with this bit, just be careful. Like sometimes if the bead is really tight, use a tyre lever to make sure that you're lifting the bead over the valve. Here I've got enough space just to lift it over, and yeah, just check that the tyre's nicely in the well, so that's the deepest section in the rim section. With a one bead mounted, often tyre guides and sort of videos on Tubeless will start splashing in pints of sealant and mounting stuff, but with Coutts Create's patented, non-patented, mess-free tubeless, what we're going to do now is just mount the other side of the tyre. You might be saying, oh no, I won't be able to get the sealant in. You will, and it will save you a little bit of mess, and it will save you a little bit of time this way. So again, start from the non-sort of valve side of the rim and just work the tyre onto the bead. So just double check that the bead is mounted all the way around and it's even on both sides, so there's not one bit that's missing. Hopefully it will have been quite tight, not so tight that you've had to break out tyre levers or break tyre levers, but tight enough that the tyre's on there, and hopefully, even with a valve core in, fingers crossed, we'll be able to just pop the tyre on the bead. Okay, it's almost like I planned it not to work that first time. So that was with a valve core in. We're going to do one attempt with a valve core out. So With PTs, one of the valve caps is very handily a valve core removal tool, so we'll just pop it out. So we'll try again one more time, but if again we have a kind of failure and it doesn't inflate after a couple of sort of like really good pushes with a good track pump, don't panic, don't keep pumping and don't keep kind of sweating and swearing. We'll just unmount the tyre, we're gonna do another wrap of rim tape, and that will bulk up that gap between the rim bed and the bead so that hopefully it will pop on, but we'll give it one more try with the valve core out and see where we go. We're starting to air up, so it's going well, so we're going to keep going. Super, with the tyre inflated up to 30 psi, we got the slightly scary pops, but those popping or kind of like snapping sounds are quite reassuring. That's just the tyre bead moving up over the little inner lip of the rim bed and popping up against the bead on the rim. We've got two options now. We can let the air out, which is fine, and then we can insert that sealant via the valve itself, so with the valve core removed, of course, or what I prefer to do, because we want to put quite a lot in there, we want to check that we can put a good amount in there and make sure there's loads of the good glittery fibres inside the tyre, is we'll deflate it and then we'll just pop one side of the rim off. What we want to do is spin the tyre around so that gap is sitting at the bottom, and then we need to make like a cocktail and give it a good shake. Check how much you need to use. For PTs at around 100ml for a 650 2.6 tyre, and you can just pour it in. So what I'm going to do is, slowly rotate the tyre around so that sealant sloshes around to the sort of sealed or closed side, and then remount the bead. It's time to pop the pump back on and inflate. Okay, this time we've got sealant in, so we can put the valve core back in. So it's kind of all one swift motion, so I may have to stop talking because I'm not very good at doing two things at once. I'm going to pop the valve off the pump, cover the hole with a finger, and then try and screw the valve core in really quite quickly. Okay, that's your tubeless setup. Hopefully it was painless. In terms of setting it up, sometimes overnight you'll have drops of pressure, and then that's just as the sealant helps seal the inside of the tyre and also helps seal the bead section around here to make sure it's nice and sealed from the air. So sometimes that uses up sealant and sometimes you can have drops in pressure. So don't worry about that, pump it up. I'd say probably the best thing you can do is actually, if you've got the right amount of sealant in there, you've done a really good job with the tape and valve as we've done step by step, actually going for a ride can really help because it opens up the tyre carcass a little bit, allows the sealant to move in and seal any kind of porous sections of carcass, and also especially kind of around the bead of the tyre into the rim. Sometimes certain tyre profiles and bead profiles need a little bit more sealant around there, and just giving it a bit of time can help that. I have seen other people do lots of sort of tapping or whooshing techniques, which in a hurry can work. So just sort of like looping the wheel back round and sort of skidding itself on the ground, just to help move the tyre and sealant around. You can leave it sort of for a couple of hours lying on a bucket, for example, just so that the sealant works into the sidewall really well. Sealant is fantastic and the new stuff now is really brilliant, but what you might need to take with you, in actual fact, I think everybody needs to take it with them with Tubeless, and that's a plug kit. You can get ones with small worms, you can get ones that are kind of built in with CO2 inflators. Essentially, if you've got a thorn that the sealant just can't fix by itself.
In today's video, we're going to show you how to fit a tyre insert onto the inside of a tyre and set it up tubeless. Now, tyre inserts are a fantastic addition, especially if you ride in really rocky conditions. They can genuinely help save your tyre from getting pinch punctures, and to a degree, they can help prevent damage to your rims as well. Here's how you do it. Okay, so there's several things you're going to need to put a tyre liner in, starting with the actual tyre liner itself. Now, there are loads of different brands on the market, starting from Cushcore, which is one of the more serious heavy-duty options out there, to all the foam liners. This one's a Vittoria Air liner. It's a foam style liner and you trim it down to size. So we're going to be fitting one of these on a spank wheel with a Vittoria tyre, and we're going to use muck-off sealant. Now, whatever brand you use, the principle is exactly the same for installing these, and other than having your liner and your tubeless setup, one of the most important things is you make sure you have a compatible valve. The fundamental difference between a regular tubeless valve and one that's compatible with inserts is the bottom. So if you look closely, the regular one only allows air to pass straight into the tyre, whereas that can get blocked by the insert itself. Now, ignoring the fact that this insert actually has a profiled shape, you should still be looking for one that has multiple ports on there for letting the air out in all directions. That means you're going to get the tyre inflated properly every time. It's just not going to happen with one of the more conventional ones. Other than that, you'll need your favourite choice in tyre sealant, some tyre levers, definitely not metal tyre levers. My recommendation would be to have some warm soapy water on hand just to help the bead get into place so it inflates first time. Then you obviously want a pump and preferably a syringe to inject the tyre sealant into the valve afterwards. It definitely saves on mess. I'll explain that when we get to that stage. And of course you need a compatible tyre that fits your relevant wheel. Step one is to get your tubeless valve in place. Now before you do this, you want to make sure that your wheel is actually taped up correctly. Use the correct width tape and make sure it's all nice and sealed on there. Now if you have a tubeless valve that has an option of changing the rubber grommet, make sure you've got the correct grommet to correlate to the shape of the rim. That way you're going to make sure you won't suffer from any sort of slow punctures in time. Now I'm just going to get the valve stem in place, put the little rubber O-ring on there. And then that little retaining lock nut. Hold that in place nicely. Okay, now depending on the brand that you have, you're more than likely going to have to trim your tyre liner down to suit, essentially. Now, everyone has a slightly different method of doing this. Now, the one I like to do is to have it on the slightly smaller side to keep it as tight as possible on there, because over time these things can grow slightly and they can rattle around on the inside. It does vary between brands though, of course. So I'm going to off mine up and then show you how I go about it. So literally hold it in place on the rim, move it all the way around. And you'll see it comes to overlap here. Now, in an ideal world, you would mark with a pen at this point and you would trim it here and then make it nice and neat. I'll make that mark, but I'll actually trim it slightly shorter than that. So when I put it tight with the cable tie that's included in the pack, it basically pulls it all nicely together and it keeps it tight in place, which is exactly what I want. Next stage is to carefully just trim it down. Obviously you want to trim it with a nice sharp knife to get the best effect, but make sure you do it where you can't damage anything else. There we go. Now just neaten it up a bit. And then you're going to need to make a small hole on both ends for the cable tie to go between. I like to use a screwdriver for this. All the way through, and then the same on the other end. Cable tie then goes in through those holes that you've made. Now I would make sure that the joining part of the cable tie, like the lock on it, is on the rim side, not on the external side. You just don't want any chance of damaging the tyre. It's better for it to butt up against the rim. And secure that cable tie. Pull that together nicely. And then trim the cable tie. And just try and make that as flush cut as you can. Now, depending on your tyre, your liner and your tubeless system option, how easy this next step is going to be will vary. So what I'd recommend is trying to do like a dry fit. When I say dry, that's not using the sealant at this stage. I would put the sealant in last in the process, and I would definitely recommend using warm soapy water. Okay, so nice bit of warm soapy water. Some people question this, but it makes it far easier, and it's just warm soapy water. It will evaporate. So I've got my valve stem here. I'm going to go with the M on the martello, which is the center of the tyre. My direction is already sorted. So I'm just going to get that first side in place. Now you may need to use tyre levers depending on your tyre and rim combination. Don't be afraid of using them if you need to. Just be cautious not to use metal ones because they can easily damage the tyre, sometimes the rim as well. Okay, first side is in place. Now it's time to get the liner in there. Now note where the holes are on the liner. There'll be a few times located around. Make sure one of these lines up with the valve stem as best as possible anyway. So I've got my valve stem here and that hole. So I'm just gonna put this in at that point. Feed the liner in place. Now this bit can be tricky because you need to get the liner all the way on the rim before you can start moving the tyre into place. And as you cut it to size, it can be quite tricky. And then it's a case of trying to work the tyre all the way around. Obviously it's much harder to get a tyre on when you've got a liner in there than it is without one, because you have to compress the liner to a point to actually get the bead in place. So don't be afraid to use tyre levers if you need to. There's no inner tube to damage on this. But as always, if you can, it's always a good idea to try and get as far as you can without them. Okay, so it's got a bit tricky here. And now it starts feeling quite difficult towards the end, but it's worth it in the long run for the additional protection you can gain. And here we go, the last bit in place. Right, so that is our tyre basically in place. The next part of the process is getting it set up tubeless. Now, what I personally like to do is not put the tubeless solution in at this point. I'm actually going to put a bit more soapy water all the way around the beading there and get the tyres seated. Yeah, so that makes it airtight straight away. Then once it's seated, we know that when we put the tyre sealant in place, it's not going to be too messy. So at that point, I'll deflate the air that's in there, leaving the tyre hopefully in place all the way around. I'll then remove the valve core and inject the tyre sealant in directly at that point, replace the valve core and then inflate the tyre, and hopefully it should be set up right. Now don't forget, you want to get this seated, so you may need a tubeless specific pump, but I'm going to get away with a regular pump here because this is quite a tight fit. If yours is a bit looser, it might be to your advantage to have one of those specific tubeless pumps. And you should hear the beads snap into place. Now, as with seating any tyre, you want to make sure you go all the way around and inspect it. And what you're looking for, it actually makes it easy to see visually on this tyre. There's like a black rim that runs around the edge of the actual rim between the grey sidewall and the bead of rubber there, so you can actually visually see that the bead is in place. Same for both sides. So I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to remove the valve core. All the air is going to come out, and then I'm going to inject the sealant in, which will set up tubeless. And the amount of sealant you use depends on your preferences. We're going to go for 70 ml in this setup. Okay, so this is the bit that can get messy. Hopefully it won't be for you. Tyre sealant in. So now I can just remove that. Just wipe any residue that's come out. Get the valve core back in place. And now time to re-inflate. Now take extreme caution if you're doing this anywhere that can't be cleaned up easily. You want to be doing this in a workshop, in a garage or outside. Avoid doing this inside where there's carpet or anything that can catch the spray if you do manage to leak any out at this stage. Because tyre sealant generally, it's quite nasty stuff on fabrics. But this time, looks like it's been nice and neat. So all I need to do is replace the valve core there, tighten it up even, put a valve cap on, and just wipe down the excess water everywhere. Now, as with any tubeless setup, before you ride the bike, you want to give it enough time to make sure the sealant has done its job on the inside, seal up any sort of small holes and things. So what I like to do is slosh it around a little bit. In today's maintenance video, we are going to show you how to remove and install a set of cranks on your mountain bike. Now you might need to do this to fit a nice shiny new upgraded set, or perhaps for some routine maintenance like changing a chainring or swapping out a bottom bracket. Now in this case we're going to show you with a set of race face cranks, but the principles are the same, doesn't matter what brand you have. Now to remove and install cranks from your bike, you're going to need a few tools, and there's just a few things to take into account. Now firstly, you're going to need a soft-ended mallet, you're going to need some Allen keys to either remove the chain guide or get it out of the way, and to remove the pedals from the bike. So in this case it's a 4mm for that chain guide and 8mm for the pedals. Yours might be a 6mm, perhaps if you're using DMR pedals for example, or perhaps you might need a pedal spanner for that if your pedals have flats on them, in order to remove them from the crank. Now you're going to need a few other things here as well. You'll need a smidgen of decent quality workshop grease. Doesn't matter what the brand, as long as it's good workshop grease. Now bearing in mind that all cranks are slightly different, but the principles are the same in the way that they're attached to the bottom bracket. Race face, for example, have the axle as part of the left-hand crank, so your non-drive side, and it's the drive side that you remove from the bike. The other brands can be the opposite. With a Shimano crank, for example, you actually have pinch bolts that hold the crank onto the axle, and you have a little preload cap on the end that you need this specific tool for. With this race face crank though, you have an 8mm bolt. It's actually got a self-extraction system built into it, so as you undo the bolt, it pulls the crank off the actual axle. So all cranks are slightly different, but the same principles there. So just take a little look at yours and figure out what you need to do. First up, you want to make sure that the clutch on your derailleur is switched off if it's a Shimano one. So that means this lever here, just moving this to the off position. So just so you can see that is in the down position. That means you can manipulate the lower cage quite easily, whereas if you had the clutch on, it makes it quite a lot harder to move that, a lot of resistance in there. Next step is to remove the pedals from the bike. Now, no matter what pedals you have on your mountain bike, they all undo towards the rear of the bike, okay? So in this case, your drive side pedal will undo with a counterclockwise movement, whereas your non-drive side will be the opposite. Okay, so I'm using an 8mm Allen key here, which means I need to get it into the back of the pedal here, and it needs to be pushed down to loosen it. And now that's loose, a bit easier just to do it like this. Now if you're using a pedal spanner, you'll do this from the drive side or the non-drive side of the bike, and you'll be pushing down in this motion without having to actuate from the back of the crank itself. Now as you can see, the chain will actually foul on the chain guide here, so you can either remove yours, or in this case I'm actually going to flip it until it's upside down so I can get access to pull the crank straight off. So let's just loosen that. If you can do this, I'd recommend doing it this way and keeping it on the bike. It just makes it a little bit easier, and you won't lose anything as well. So it just gives me direct access there, so I can have the crank and take it straight off. Now because the crank on this bike is a race face, it means that I'm undoing it on the drive side. So this might be different for yours if you have to do it on the opposite side of the bike. Now you want to get yourself in a position where you have a lot of leverage. So I'm putting the tyre effectively in my armpit. I'm going to hold the left hand crank against the chainstay, and it puts me in a good strong position to put a good amount of weight on that 8mm Allen key. Let's not forget that this is a crank that's attached to the bottom bracket, and it could well have been torqued up very tight. Always make sure that Allen key is fully home, can't go in any further, and obviously, as you should with any bike job anyway, make sure the Allen keys you're using are of decent quality. Make sure there's no damage to the ends of them. You're going to be putting a lot of weight on this 8mm Allen key, so do make sure it can't damage your bike or slip at all. Then it's a case of putting the pressure on to release it. And then as you back the Allen key out, you'll find now there's resistance. This resistance is the Allen key bolt against that self-extraction system. Now as I undo this, you'll find the crank actually starts moving out by itself. Okay, so I'm approaching the end of the axle now, so I'm expecting, there we go, the crank to slip off. Now at this stage, you want to make sure you get a good hold of it, carefully slide it off, and then just let the left-hand crank slide down there. Take care, because on some cranks you'll find if there's any washers like this thin one here, it might slip off, you might drop it, it might roll under something. So just do take a bit of care at this point. I'm carefully just going to unravel the chain, let that dangle down there. And then we have our drive side crank off the bike. And now it's time to move on to the non-drive side. Now, depending how long the crank has been in the bottom bracket itself, it might be quite stuck in there. So give this a little test first. See if you can actually just push it out like I can there by hand. But if you can't do that, you're going to need to shock it loose. So to shock it loose, you will need a soft-ended mallet. And you just simply give it a sharp little strike on the edge. Make sure it's a soft-ended mallet that's not going to damage it, and don't go crazy. It's literally just enough to tap it loose there, and then you should be able to slide the axle all the way out. As you slide the axle out of the bottom bracket, take care because there will be washers on the other side as well that you could drop on the floor. Now, before you think about reinstalling the cranks, you've got to make sure the interface is nice and clean. So you've already checked the chainring, that's all torqued up nicely. You want to make sure that the crank arm itself is free from damage. You can put a very fine amount of grease on there. You also need to check the preload system. Now, this will differ between brands. Now, on the Shimano system, you'd put the crank straight back on and you'd leave the 2 pinch bolts loose, and then use the preload tool on the end cap to put it all together before adjusting the pinch bolts. Whereas on the race face system, it actually has a little collar here. So you have a tiny little Allen key head that goes in here, and this collar actually rotates against the shell. So you want to make sure that this is backed out against the crank arm before you put the crank arm in place. Slide the spacer up, put a small amount of grease on, assemble the system back together, tighten the right hand crank, the drive side, and then you would back this out against it, and that would compress things together in the same way that Shimano does externally. Now, it's slightly different between different systems, but it's fairly easy to work out. Just remember, if you do have a collar as part of the crank, to loosen it off at this part of the process. Now, just take care when you slide your crank back into place. Make sure if yours had any spacers on that they go on first as they were. And then just delicately slide your crank back into position. Now, before you install the other part of the crank, just to check a few things first. This one had 1 washer on the drive side, so I'm just going to slide that in place now, so I can't forget that. You want a very small amount of grease just on the interface here. You can put it on the axle, you can put it on the inside of the crank there. And the last thing to check, this sounds like a very obvious one, but make sure your crank arms are orientated correctly. It can be very easy to get one on that's just a slight bit out. You've got to make sure that 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock to correspond with each other. So I'm just going to put a teeny bit of grease just on the end of the axle there. Really doesn't need much, just a very small amount. It's just installation purposes. And then offer the crank up in the correct position. Confirm it lines up with the one on the other side of the bike. And then start tightening the bolt until it starts pulling the crank back into place. Now, before you get carried away at this stage, it's important to look and see if there are torque settings on your crank arm. Now, this particular one says the bolt, the 8mm bolt, should be tightened to 50 Newton meters. That's pretty tight. As it's a crank arm, it has a lot of pressure going through it. You don't want any chance of this coming loose, okay? So tighten this sufficiently. Again, so I've got the tyre under my armpit here, and I can put pressure on the left-hand non-drive side crank against this Allen key. So I'm just going to tighten the Allen key as it pulls the crank into place. And that feels good to me. That's nice and tight. And we're going to definitely check that though, just to see where we are with the torque setting. There we go. And that is tight and safe. Now it's time to get the chain back on, and this is why you needed to turn the clutch off or use the cage lock, because otherwise you'd be fighting that rear derailleur spring. So just pull the derailleur cage down nicely, give you all the slack that you need, and then get the chain back onto the chainring at this point. And then let the derailleur just take up the slack there, and your chain sits on nicely. Now, the last thing to do if your bike has a chain guide on there is to get this aligned again. Now, something important to say, if you took your cranks off to change the chainring size, for example, you might not find that the chain guide is compatible, or your one might have to go in a slightly different position. Now, many chain guides on the market will cater for 30, 32, 34 teeth, and they will have little markings that correspond to those, so just make sure yours lines up. So all I need to do in this case, because it's a chainring like for like, was just to realign the guide. It was in the correct position to start with. Okay, last thing then, pedals back on, go and hit the trails. No matter how competent you are fixing your bike and working with tools, From time to time, it can actually be really easy to slip an Allen key and round out the head of a bolt. In particular, things like those little 4mm stem bolts, or perhaps the tiny little 2.5 or 3mm bolts you have holding on your handlebar grips. More often than not, this will happen when you're out on the trail with a regular trail style multi-tool, and perhaps you've just not had enough purchase and you just slipped and rounded the head out. Now in this video, I'm going to show you 4 different ways to get those bolts out, 2 of which have never failed me. In an ideal world, when you put your bike together, you would be using a torque wrench, and of course you would be using grease or anti-seize in the relevant places, but it doesn't always happen, and sometimes we can all hang off an Allen key too much, over tightening a bolt, meaning it's very tricky to get out. Now, ultimately, how mashed up the head of the bolt is will dictate how you're able to get it out. Number 4, which we're going to get to later in the video, is the extreme method, which will always work, but you do require some power tools. Option 1, we're going to go straight to now, I like to call traction key. Now, if you look up close here, I've got an old Hope stem, and I've actually rounded out some of the heads of these bolts in advance for this video. One of them is completely hopeless, there's nothing on here, in which case you will need a more extreme way of getting it out. But this one here should look quite familiar to you. I think we've all done one of these before. Now, the Allen key does go in, but it's really quite a bad fit, and you're quite aware that any sort of pressure on it means it's going to slip. But the fact it can still get purchased means you might be able to rescue this by using a bit of rubber. Now, the concept of this comes from drilling with screws. Now, it's quite easy to round out a head of a screw, but you can add extra traction by putting a rubber band over the top of that screw and then leaning on your screw bit basically to undo it. It gives you traction. Now, a rubber band isn't going to fit inside this. However, rubber nitrile gloves do, and they give just enough traction. If you just wrap the glove around the end, maybe twice the thickness, over the end of the Allen key there, and you can get it into place. It was this one. And it just adds a little bit of security like that, and you can actually undo it. So that is your first port of call. To do something like that, it's non-damaging to the bolt, non-damaging to your Allen key as well, because you're adding a bit of grip. However, something important to say is always make sure you have the best Allen keys you can. Even if they're budget ones, stop using them when they start getting rounded edges on them, because they will damage bolts. Regularly inspect your Allen keys, make sure they have nice sharp edges, and hopefully you won't get problems like this. Okay, next up is basically fudging in a different size Allen key, Torx key, Imperial Allen key, something like that. Now, because these are 4mm stem bolts, you can actually get a fairly good bit of purchase, although I wouldn't recommend doing it with a nice new tool, with a Torx T25. It's possible, because of the extra edging you get from that star profile, to just get a little extra purchase. And as you can see, this bolt actually came out, but it might not always work, and it is a bit more of a bodge, so I wouldn't recommend doing this on a regular basis. You will damage your multi-tool, and of course you're going to damage the head of the bolt, but if it's beyond repair, then it might be a good option for you. Now, the other option is if you have access to an Imperial Allen key. So you get Imperial and you get metric. Now, they don't always correspond, okay, but you can get away with these sometimes. So for example, if you look on screen here, you'll see a 332 can just about go into a 3.5mm Allen key head. So if you've badly rounded out a 3mm Allen key head, there is a chance you're going to be able to jam in the 332 to undo it. And the same goes with a 732. So that will go into a 5.5mm, so a bad 5mm that's been rounded out. There's a chance you can rescue it if you do have some of these laying around at home. Definitely worth a try. Okay, now we're getting serious for options 3 and 4. Now, option 3 has never failed me, and I have to confess, I actually got this idea from a friend. This wasn't something I came up with, and it's genius. But you do require a sacrificial Allen key. So quite often, when you buy a component for your bike, it may come with an Allen key. And quite often, they're not always the highest quality, but keep them. Keep them in the back of your toolkit, because they might come in handy for something like this. And what you essentially want to do is bond the Allen key into the head of the bolt. Now, it does require a bit of precision, because you don't want that, I'm going to be using Araldite to show you this, but you don't want to get the epoxy or whatever it is you're using anywhere near anything else. Get it just the teeniest bit in the head of the bolt, and literally you're going to have to wait for it to set, but As you can see, like I'm just going to put some Araldite in here now. Araldite is actually a 2-part formula, so you have to mix the two together. You really don't need much. I'm just going to use a little bit of cardboard just to smear in the teeniest bit into the head of the bolt. I'm going to push the Allen key in, and then, well, you actually just have to wait now, wait for it to set. Don't be tempted though to do this before it's completely set. The best advice really is to leave it overnight to make sure it's really, really hard. And then you can simply use the Allen key to undo the bolt and take it straight out. But like I said, it's a sacrificial Allen key, so you won't be using that one again. Okay, and the last option, which literally never fails, but it can take a bit of perseverance, is to drill it out. So of course you're going to need a drill for this that's got quite a good high torque power on it, because you need to do this very slowly and precisely. You're going to need some specific bits. Got a little set here. It's actually fairly cheap. I actually got this one from Amazon. It's not really the sort of thing you use that often. I mean, if you're a pro mechanic, you'll probably have easy outs or any number of high quality versions of these, but we simply don't need them. Now, essentially, if you look up close, the bits themselves, you actually use these in reverse to cut into the head of the bolt. And you would use the nearest size to the head of the bolt itself, because you want to use the whole structure of that head. Now that in itself is something important to suggest. Ones that are squarer in profile like this have more material on. Now it always works with these, or at least it's always worked for me. But sometimes you get tapered ones like this. Now you can't be quite so precise, and quite often you can actually break the head of the bolt off in doing this, so just be careful if you're going to do that. Now there is one other option as well for doing this process, and that is to drill the head of the bolt clean off, i.e. drilling it in with a bigger bit so the head of the bolt shears off. Now this would be a good idea to do on the cleat on the bottom of a shoe, for example, that can be rusted in sometimes. You drill the head of the bolt off, it releases a pressure on the cleat. You can literally pull the cleat straight off, and then you're left with the exposed bit of thread, which will have no tension on it at that point. You use set pliers to undo it. But in this case, the cool way that we're going to take it out is by screwing in a left-handed thread. Of course, as you screw in a left-handed thread with your drill in reverse, that's the direction the bolt needs to undo itself. It's a really, really cool process, but it can take a bit of time. So just take your time and it'll come out just like this. Okay, so the most important thing is to make sure your drill is in reverse, because you need to be cutting it in that direction. And the same goes for the threaded bit you're going to be using to get the bolt out. Nice and slow, lots of torque on that drill as well. Now with bigger bolts, you may need to use cutting oil, but you just want to get drilling in there. Don't go hammering in too fast. Keep it nice and straight. Now you might notice this stem is actually tightened up into the vise here. I'm not using any soft jaws, but you might need to do this on the bike itself, in which case you'll definitely need a friend to help you to keep the parts straight. Now you don't have to go all the way in, but you want to go far enough that those threads are going to be able to get good purchase in the head of that bolt. If you wonder why I'm in a bit of a funny position, it's just so I can monitor it. Just make sure it's staying straight. And I think that's probably about as close as I need to get in there. So let's come out on that. So this is the cool bit. Now hopefully this should work, otherwise it'll look bad on camera. But again, drill in reverse, and then it should come straight out. Bingo. Bolt head straight out. Adjusting the gears on your mountain bike can seem a little bit tricky, but honestly it's really simple as soon as you know all the components on the derailleur. It's also a great skill to learn because you're going to need to adjust your gears in time, and also means you can help your friends out as well. Now in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to do that on a Shimano derailleur, but the principle remains the same whatever brand you have. Okay, so before we make any adjustments, let me just explain to you the layout of a rear derailleur. Now in my hand here is, I think it's Neil's old derailleur. It might be crash damaged, it's a bit scuffed up and it's a bit dirty. This is a Shimano DL XT. It might be more expensive than the one you have, but it has the same basic functions and features. Now starting at the top here, you have the bolt that mounts it to the bike. Now this can be a 4, a 5, or sometimes a Torx, depending on the particular model or the year model you have. Typically it's a 5. Next up you have the parallelogram part. Now this is a sprung cage. Now you have this on all derailleurs, and this fundamentally is what enables the derailleur to move and shift the chain between those sprockets. Next up, you have the sprung lower cage. This is the lower part of the derailleur here. I'm just going to turn it around so you can see this. And you've got two wheels on this. These are known as pulley wheels, guide wheels, or sometimes even as jockey wheels. Now these are essentially the same on all derailleurs, and this sprung cage simply moves backwards and forwards so it can take up the slack in the chain and also enable it when you're in those bigger gears or the bigger sprockets for the chain to be able to stretch and basically compensate for that. Now on some derailleurs like this one, you'll see a clutch. The telltale sign of that is you'll have a little lever right here where you can turn it on and flick it off. It's a non-essential thing. It helps keep your chain on and make your bike quieter, but it doesn't affect the performance of changing gears. And accordingly, it's not something that we're going to look at in this video. Now, the 3 points of adjustment that you really have are the limit screws and the B screw. The B screw, if we deal with that one first, that adjusts the gap between the top of the guide wheels and the bottom of your cassette. The reason you need to make that adjustment is sometimes you might have a cassette and the biggest tooth will be a 42, some might be a 51 like I have on this bike here. Accordingly, the derailleur has to be set at a slightly different height in order to do its job properly. So once you've done that, you never really need to adjust it again. And then there's the limit screws. These simply set the maximum limits a derailleur can move within, over the small sprocket or over the large sprocket. Of course, if you have it in the wrong place on the large sprocket, there's a chance that your chain can hop into the spokes. So it's really key to make sure that you have those limit screws adjusted correctly. And they can also, if you've not got them adjusted correctly, just interfere with the indexing of your gears. Now, if you wonder what indexing is, that's simply the term that's used to refer to one click per gear. One gear, one gear, one gear, and so forth. The final thing that you'll see on all derailleurs is where the cable comes in. So if you look at the one on my chainstay on my bike here and you look back at this one in my hand, you can see how it works. The outer hose comes into the back here and then is simply secured on this arm on the inside of the derailleur. And there you go. They're the fundamental parts of a rear derailleur and they're all pretty much the same. Okay, so now it's time to get a rear derailleur indexed. Fundamentally, there are only a few things you need to be doing. The first one is to make sure the derailleur is straight and is securely fastened to the bike. The next one is to adjust those limit screws. So we're going to take a close look at doing that. And the final one is making sure you have the correct cable tension. Once you've got those three simple things sorted out, your gears will work like a dream. Now, before you start the process, you obviously want to make sure that the derailleur is in good enough condition to work on and that your cable passes freely within the outer cable. Just give it a run through the gears, and regardless of them being indexed, you should feel if there's any additional friction. If there is, then you might want to replace that. Okay, before we start making adjustments, you just got to make sure your bike is in the correct gear first. So shift down until you're in that smallest sprocket at the back. That is your highest gear. Now at the bars, you're going to be using your finger to do that. So shift it until you're in that gear, and then you want to wind the barrel adjuster back in towards the shifter. So first up, let's move on to getting the limits adjusted. Now, if you've got a clutch on your derailleur, it will definitely help you and benefit you if the clutch is actually switched off. Mine already was then, I was just reaching to check. And then you're going to need an Allen key or a screwdriver depending on what your derailleur is. This one takes a 2mm, yours may well be a Phillips or a crosshead style screwdriver. Now, if you position yourself with line of sight, what you're looking for is the rear derailleur, both wheels here, to be lined up completely in a vertical line underneath that sprocket. Now, if you manipulate the lower cage down here, you can actually get a really good position to see here. Now just note how vertical that is. If the derailleur itself is actually bent, then you're going to need to adjust that. Now note as I make an adjustment here, if I'm turning this screw clockwise, this clockwise on the limit screw, you can see the derailleur moving inboard, and anti-clockwise it moves outboard. If it's too far inboard, you'll never get that small gear or the high gear. And if it's too far the opposite way, then the chain could jump off the top accidentally and take off your paint or get jammed in there. So it's a good reason to make sure it's properly lined up. It's really that simple. Of course, getting the vantage point is key, and that is why you should sit at the back of the bike here. Now next, you want to repeat this with the bigger sprocket, but there are a few little factors here. The first one is if you have massive tyres on your bike, it can be really hard to get a good line of sight. If that's the case, then you might want to consider removing your rear tyre. The next thing to take into account is if you have your cable on the derailleur already, or if the cable is in place. Now you can either manipulate the derailleur into the position, which means you don't need the cable, or you can use your gears if your cable is mounted. I'm just going to manually manipulate my derailleur there. So just carefully move the derailleur and spin the pedals around. Obviously you have to make careful your face doesn't hit the tyre if you're doing what I'm doing here. And there we go. So it's in the biggest sprocket. Now I'm just going to hold the derailleur cage here so I can see. As I explained before, line of sight is absolutely key to this. It can be really tricky, and I've got my eye right at the edge of the tyre here, but I can see what I'm doing. So same as adjusting the other limit screw, you want to make sure that that derailleur cage is vertically underneath that. Now it can take a bit more messing around here to get that just right, but once you have, it's the key to good shifting. It's doubly important at the top here though. If it's not enabling the derailleur to travel high enough, you're not going to get into that bigger gear, which you're going to need on the steep climbs. But more importantly, if it overshifts, then you can create damage. You could strain the derailleur or snap it. You could snap the Mech hanger. You could jam the chain behind the cassette in between the spokes, which can break the chain, and it can also break spokes. So do take care with that. Take a bit of time, there's no rush, and you'll get it just right. The next adjustment you need to be making is the B tension, or that B screw. Now this basically pivots the derailleur slightly and it enables the top jockey wheel there just to be spaced apart from the biggest of the cassette sprockets there. Now it's really important to get this right because you just won't get clean shifting if it's wrong, basically. Now the height does depend on the Mech and the cassette combination you have. If you've got up to 11 speed and you've got a 42 tooth as your biggest, you're looking at between a 5 and 6 millimeter gap between that top jockey wheel and the top of the cassette rings there. And if you've got up to, I think it's a 46, you need between 8 and 9 millimeters. However, if you've got 12 speed, things are a little bit more simplified. You don't have to remember those numbers. If you look on the reverse of the Mech, you'll actually see a little mark in there. It could be a groove or it could be a painted mark like on this XTR one here. And all you have to do is go around the non-drive side of the bike and you have to use that B screw clockwise to make it move down, anti-clockwise to make it move back up, to get basically to line up that line or the groove with the sprockets. It's really quite simple, but it can be hard to see if you've got a big grime on it like this one has. But look closely and you can see it. Now note, just watching the derailleur moving up and down as I do this, you can see exactly what's going on. And like I say, with line of sight looking around the back here, I can see at this point it's perfectly in line. So that is the correct height for your B screw. Okay, so you've got your B tension adjusted and you've got your outer and inner limit set. The last thing you need to master is just getting your cable tension right. And then that way we can get the indexing dialed in. Now, what you're gonna need to do is just undo the cable clamp. On this derailleur, it's a 4 millimeter and it's just located at the back here. I'm just gonna carefully undo that. And then what you're wanting to do is pull the cable through, make sure it's orientated correctly in there. Now it does differ on some derailleurs, but you can clearly see the orientation of the way it moves around the bolt and there's a little groove for it to slot into. Now you want to pull this through until it's taut, never tight. If it's too tight, it's going to be very unlikely you're going to get back down into this sprocket. And you can even see by pulling it how much of a difference it makes because it's quite a light action system. So like I said, you just want to pull it to be taut. And then you want to nip the bolt up to tighten that. Now sometimes when you're tightening it, you might want to just, as it gets tighter, just hold the cage of the derailleur just to resist it moving. There we go. Okay, so now the cable, as you can see here, I can still move it by hand slightly, so it's taut and not tight. That's the key. Okay, and now for the last step, the most important one is to make sure your gears are indexed. Of course, this is the correlation of one click at the shifter giving you one gear when you pedal. Now we're going to start with it in this smallest sprocket because that's where we've made those last adjustments. And then we're going to pedal it along slightly in the work stand here and apply one click at the lever. Now with any luck, that might correlate to one click giving one gear shift. And it has perfectly actually. And then back down again. The idea is to make sure the first 3 or 4 sprockets you've got perfect shifting between them. So I'm going to set it up to show you what happens if it's not quite right. if for example there's too much tension here, it's actually going to go up 2 or 3 gears instead of just going up the 1 gear. So I'm just going to put an extra bit of tension on. And you'll see when I change gear, it will jump up more than 1 sprocket. So it wants to jump 2 there. There you go, and it's actually gone up. Now it's just 1 click. So although it goes back down again, just do 1 click and it jumps up 3 times. There we go. So in this case, I want to make sure that I take some of that cable tension back off again. All it is tweaking that cable tension. You can do this 1/4 of a turn at a time until you've got it just right. 1 gear, 1 click, all the way up the cassette. And it should be relatively smooth shifting up and down. Like I said, if there's not enough cable tension, it's not going to jump up a gear, so you need to apply some more cable tension. If there's too much cable tension, it's going to jump up too many gears. So just experiment with that at the lever end there where you have the barrel adjuster on there, and then you'll get your gears absolutely mastered. Well, that's the basics of how you adjust a Shimano rear derailleur to get that perfect shifting. Like I said at the beginning of the video, it's the same principle whether you've got an Asira X level derailleur or all the way through to an XTR. They all work in exactly the same way. So just take the time to try and understand your derailleur a bit. From time to time, you will need to adjust the derailleur gears on your bike. And it can sound a bit tricky if you don't know what you're doing. But actually, once you understand the basics of the hardware itself, it's very easy and something that anyone can do at home. So in today's video, we're going to do this with a SRAM derailleur. But fear not, if you have a Shimano one on your bike, we've already made that video, so you can check that one out in the description underneath. Okay, so before we get started making any adjustments to this bike whatsoever, let's just take you through what the SRAM derailleurs look like. Now, the function and the form is exactly the same really as most other derailleurs on the market, but they do have a few small features that set them aside. Now, the basics look pretty similar to anything else. You have a lower cage unit known as the lower cage, and it has 2 wheels on there. These could be called guide wheels or jockey wheels, and sometimes pulleys. They rotate on little bearings, and the responsibility of this cage is basically to take up the slack in the chain when you're in a higher gear. A higher gear means smaller sprockets, so there's a bit of an abundance of chain, and that is sprung to take up that slack. And accordingly, when you go into a lower gear, which means using more chain, it goes the opposite way to accommodate for that. Now, this lower cage is heavily sprung and it actually has a clutch design. Now, unlike the Shimano one that you can turn on and off, the SRAM one you can't turn on and off, but it does have a locking feature, which means it's really easy to adjust, and also means it's super easy to remove your rear wheel. It's a genius feature and it's exclusive to SRAM. So we'll show you how to work that a bit later in the video. Now, as far as shifting goes, it has the same parallelogram style design as you've seen on most derailleurs. This correlates to when you're doing the clicks with your shifter, it will move across and enable the chain to derail from sprocket to sprocket. And then there's 3 main adjustments and a cable clamp. Cable clamp obviously just clamps that cable that you're operating at the shifter end. And the 3 adjustments, 2 of them are your limits for smaller sprocket and your larger sprocket, just to make sure the derailleur can limit the movement that it has. And the other one is the B tension, also known as the B screw. This one is responsible for the height of these guide wheels in relation to that cassette. You need to have this sprocket correctly adjusted for clean shifting. And we're going to show you exactly how to do it. It's dead simple. Okay, so firstly, let's have a bit of a system reset to make sure everything is ready before you can make any adjustments. So let's go up to the shifter first. Now, this is the barrel adjuster. Its job is to take up any slack in the system. You can sometimes hear this referred to as cable stretch, but it's not technically cable stretch because the metal cable doesn't stretch. But you do get slack in the system as the outer housing and the sheaths and stuff can bed into place, so you get small amounts of movement in that system. It's a simple screw-in barrel basically, and it compensates for that slack. So I want you to screw it back into the shifter, basically giving it more slack. So you might find the outer housing here moves around a bit. Now just have a quick double check, make sure everything feels smooth. Does the shifter feel smooth? If it doesn't, give it a little bit of spray lube on the inside there. You might need to replace the inner cable itself. If that's something you do need to do, before you go any further, check the video out that's in the description underneath this one, and it shows you how to replace a cable on a derailleur, and also deals with a little bit of generic information about indexing your gears, but we will cover that with this particular video. Now have a bit of a sense check when you're up at the front end here. Make sure the cables and the hoses are all long enough that your steering is not constricted and none of them are pulling on anything. If any of those hoses are being crimped or kinked around adversely, or they're being pulled on, that will hamper your gear shifting and your brakes and other things on the bike. So just do a sense check and make sure everything is operating smoothly. And just before we get onto the actual derailleur itself, just have a quick sense check around your transmission. Make sure that the actual cranks rotate freely as they should do, and make sure that there's no stiff links or any obvious damage to your chainring, your chain or your rear sprockets, which is also known as the cassette. Assuming this is all good, let's get started. Now first things first is to make sure that the derailleur is aligned correctly. So get yourself in a position, maybe on a stool or something similar, low down, and get behind the bike. Now if you've got massive tyres on your bike, this actually can be quite hard, and it might be easy, for example, if you've got a fat bike or you've got plus size tyres, to actually remove the rear tyre from the bike. You'll need the wheel in there, of course, to make this adjustment because that's where your gears are situated. However, on this bike, I can just about see, so we're gonna make do with this. Now I'm using a line of sight, I'm looking at the derailleur, I wanna make sure that the derailleur itself is hangs completely vertically underneath that small sprocket. It's really important that it's nice and straight here. Now do note that if your derailleur is an old one, it's been bashed a few times, the lower cage could be a bit bent, so just pay attention there. And also pay attention to the hanger that the derailleur bolts to on the bike. That could also be bent. Now, if any of those things is a bit of a problem, you will need to tackle that at this point because you won't get clean shifting if it's not aligned. It's that simple. Now, to make that sort of adjustment, there's a few specific tools, but you can get away with using an adjustable spanner. If you want to see me using an adjustable spanner to do exactly that, the video where I fix up an old shed bike essentially is in the description underneath, and that was really bent, and the derailleur itself was bent, and I manipulated it by hand and got it working perfectly. So you can check that video out, and it'll give you some other tips on doing up some knackered components as well. Just because they're knackered, it doesn't mean you can't keep using them. Anyway, I digress. Back onto this. So now we're looking at the derailleur, it's hanging straight underneath that bottom sprocket, but we want to check that it's correctly aligned as well. Now this is where your limit screws come in. Now note there's two screws here. Now depending on the model year of your particular derailleur, it might have a crosshead screw there, or like this one, it might have an Allen key, in which case it's a 3mm. Now there's two screws here, one correlates to the lower gears, which is your bigger sprocket, and one correlates to the higher gear, which we want to adjust, which is the smaller sprocket. Now note here, as I adjust it, you can see that sprocket moving around. You want to get it until it's directly underneath that smallest sprocket. Now make sure you move around a little bit to get the best vantage point because you want to be completely in line. This is why I said the tyre can get in the way here. So if the tyre is a problem, it might serve you to get rid of the tyre to make this process an easier one. Now if you're struggling to make this adjustment and you're finding the derailleur is not reacting enough, there might still be too much cable tension on the system. So in which case, you want to undo or loosen the cable clamp. Now again, depending on the derailleur, this could be a 4mm. If it's really old, it could be a 5mm. On this case, I need a Torx T25 in here. So I'm just going to loosen this off, and you can see the cable now is nothing to do with it. So there's no cable tension affecting the derailleur. Now if you do this, you might find when you undo the bolt, the derailleur naturally just moves a fraction. It might just be a couple of millimeters, in which case you found the first bit of the problem. Now return to making the adjustment on the lower part here until the derailleur is completely in line. Now you can just check that the derailleur functions freely by cycling the bike through the gears and manually manipulating the derailleur. Be careful where you put your hands, but you can use your thumb on the parallelogram to just push the derailleur through a few of the gears as you're cycling through using your hand on the pedal. Take your time with this and you'll get an idea. You'll be able to see if the chain is naturally going to drop back down again when you release your hand from there. The derailleur should just allow the chain to pop back down onto that smaller sprocket. If that's good, then now's the time to put that cable tension back on. Now it's really important to say when you're pulling the inner cable through the system here, you don't want to be pulling it tight. Because the derailleurs have such a small amount of cable pull to operate them or actuate them, you can mess things up here. So you want to pull the cable until it's taut. Now I recommend using something like a set of needle nose pliers because it makes it really easy to grip and they're really precise. You can use regular pliers, they're not quite as accurate though. Now give the cable a bit of a pull just to make sure everything is in place on the bike. If your cable is externally routed, you can check the stops just to make sure that the cable housing is sitting into the stops correctly and nothing's going to sort of give a bit later on. Give the cable a good hard pull and then you want to gently follow that cable routing round. Be sure to make sure you follow the correct cable routing. It's very slightly different on all derailleurs, but it is generally very obvious. Note how this one follows around here where the housing enters the derailleur and you can see a little groove that the cable sits into. Now I want you to just pull it taut and then tighten it up with the pinch bolt there, making sure that the cable is correctly clamped. Now with any luck, if you've got this right, the derailleur won't have actually moved, but you will have secured that cable. Now the first part of indexing your gears here is to see if the derailleur jumps up with one click at the shifter. The aim here is one click per gear. This is known as the indexing of your gears. Now try this by cycling the bike along with your hand on the pedal and just changing gears at the shifter. Now this makes sense if you've got your bike in a work stand. If you haven't, you might need a friend to help you here, but honestly, a work stand is the best friend for this. It's a third hand essentially and so useful for many other jobs. Now cycle through, one click of the shifter and it should hopefully correlate to the derailleur jumping up one gear. If it's not quite managing to jump up, then you need to apply a bit of tension using the barrel adjuster back at the shifter, because that means there's a little bit of slack in the system somewhere. You need to compensate for that. Now hopefully if you've pulled the cable taut enough, you might just need to add quarter or half a turn or maybe a full turn. Make the adjustment and try again until the chain jumps up cleanly onto that sprocket and then select it so you can jump back down again. If you can get that one gear nice and smooth, you're doing well. Next up is to make sure this works correctly for the first 4 gears or so. And pretty much once you've got those 4 gears working smoothly going up and down, it's going to work perfectly the whole way up, but there's still some more adjustments to make a bit later. Now, if your chain was actually overshifting and going up too much, there was too much tension in the system. Now this means you've actually pulled too much cable through. You pulled it tight, not taut, like I said. So in which case you need to reduce that again. So back to the clamp again, release that cable and then pull it taut. Remember, taut, not tight. That is the key to getting correct shifting. Back to square one again. Shift it 1 gear until you get it to clean 4 gears up and down and it's working nicely between them. And now it's time to move on to making your lower adjustment. So lower correlates to the lower gear, which is the biggest sprocket. That is the one at the spokes side of your wheel. Now this one is a crucial one to make because if it's not right, you might not get into that gear to start with, which is annoying because you won't be able to climb up those really steep climbs and use your full range of gears. But worse, if you overshift, there's a chance your chain can get caught between the back of the cassette and the spokes. This can snap your chain, it can damage your wheel, and it can be a real pain to get out again. So make sure you get this one right. Same thing applies. Get the bike up into that gear. Now just take caution in case it overshifts. And then using your line of sight, this is where it's really quite difficult if you have a big tyre, especially in this combo because you're so far inboard of the wheel and that's almost directly in line with the rim. So it can be very tricky at this point. Again, if you're struggling here, you will need to make sure the tyre is not on the bike. Now continue making adjustments to that limit screw until the upper of those wheels is sat directly underneath, completely in line with that biggest sprocket on your rear cassette. Now before you start playing with the gears, there's one final adjustment you need to make sure of. And this is a perfect time to do it because you make the adjustment only in this gear, in your biggest or your lowest gear. And this is called B tension. So there's a B tension screw, this is it, also known as the B screw. And the responsibility of this is to make sure the derailleur is at the correct height in relation to that cassette. It adjusts, when you look carefully, I'll just make an adjustment here and you can see the top wheel moving up and down slightly in relation to the cassette. Now this is a really important adjustment to make because it can make the difference between your gears shifting smoothly or everything just not working quite right despite everything else being exactly right. this can really affect everything. Now, you want to have 15 millimeters of daylight between the biggest sprocket and this wheel when you are sat on your bike. Right, so that is if you have a suspension bike, it needs to be sagged. So trying to get this can be quite difficult, and it ends up actually being about 4 or 5 millimeters when you're not on the bike like this one is in the stand. But thankfully, SRAM make this little gizmo. They make this for the Eagle, like I have on here, which is 12 speed, but they also make it for 11 speed and other derailleurs. So it's a really good tool to have. If you manage to buy your bike, if you bought your bike new, it's probably got one of these in with the manuals. If you bought the derailleur new, it will come with one of these. If you haven't got one and it costs a couple of quid, it's well worth getting one from your local bike shop, or just ordering one online if you can't source one, if you're not near a bike shop. And all you do is hook this around the upper jockey wheel there and basically correlate the sprockets to this, and then basically make your adjustment with the B screw until this is dead in line, and you'll have perfect shifting. The name of the game here really is to get that upper wheel as close as you can to the biggest sprocket without fouling on it. The closer it is, the cleaner shifting you'll get coming back down that cassette into your higher gears. If it's too far away, it will really struggle basically. So make sure you get that adjustment just right. Now with the B screw adjusted correctly, you can now check if your gear indexing works correctly, because you still might need to make a fraction of adjustment to that upper limit for that big lower sprocket there. So run back down the gears and it should correlate to 1 click per gear. Is it working? Brilliant. If it's not hopping up or it's not going down, you will need to make just a bit of a fine adjustment to that limit, and in which case, then job's a good one. There you go, so we've made most of the adjustments to the derailleur to make sure it works and get your indexing working. There's 2 more things to go into. One is the constant adjustment you'll need to make, we'll get to that in a sec. And the other one is the cage lock, which we haven't covered yet. Now the cage lock is a little button here, and it basically protrudes out the back and it locks the cage in place. This makes it dead easy to remove the wheel from the bike. You'd simply rotate the cage forwards, press the button, and you see it will hold the cage completely locked out. Genius feature. Now if you are struggling to make that adjustment on the smaller sprocket at the back, you can lock the cage out and it can actually give you a slightly more clean line of sight. If something's bent, this will expose it, so that's a good one to go back to if you have been struggling. Now the last thing to say is about the constant adjustment. With any set of gears, whether you're using a new cable or even an old system like this one that I have just made some adjustments to, there'll be a settling in period. People will tell you this is where your cable stretches. It's not. This is where the cables, the outer cables that is, settle into the sheaths, into the housing, into the ferrules, into parts of the frame. As you move around on the bike, you go through the suspension, everything creaks and moves around. As this naturally happens, there will be some slack that's created, and you'll need to compensate by just dialing in that barrel adjuster. But you can do that instead of wasting time doing it in the stand. You can go for a ride, go through all those gears, make sure everything's working as nicely as you hope, and you probably find after a first proper ride, maybe 2 or 3 rides, that you might have a slight delay shifting up from the bottom sprocket into the first one up. And you might just need half a turn or a quarter of a turn just to add a bit more tension on the system. And really that's about it. It's a very simple system. It works on cable tension and just some limit screws essentially. Dead simple. I love cable gears. Hopefully this video has been useful for you. Again, it's just a specialist video for those needing to adjust a SRAM derailleur.